For months, Ukraine has been begging its allies for a green light to strike Russian soil with Western-supplied long-range weapons. On November 17, 2024, that green light finally came. And Ukraine didn't waste a second. A barrage of missiles flew toward Russia's territory in the following days, but none of them hit the invader as hard as the UK supplied Storm Shadow missiles. These missiles, launched on November 20th, absolutely decimated the enemy, even taking out senior officials, and Russia doesn't have many left. Ukraine's message was crystal clear: no one is safe. No one and nowhere. Not in occupied Ukraine, not even in the heart of Russia. Stay with us as we have all the details of this devastating strike in this video. Let's start with the background to help you understand why the Storm Shadow missile strike is such a huge deal. The UK first supplied Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine in May 2023. However, this first batch of missiles came with a condition. They weren't to be used to attack Russian territory. They were supposed to only be used to defend Ukraine's territory against Russian forces. Naturally, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky protested this condition. He claimed that the only way for Ukraine to win was to hit military targets on Russian soil that were orchestrating attacks against his country. However, the UK wasn't the only country to impose these limitations. All of Ukraine's Western allies did so, including the United States. The first loosening of the restrictions came in May 2024, following the onset of Russia's long-anticipated summer offensive. Ukraine was now allowed to strike targets inside Russia, and only military facilities used to launch attacks into Ukraine. This was good news for Ukraine, but still not enough. If we want to win, if we want to prevail, if we want to save our country and to defend it, we need to lift all limitations, Zelensky pleaded. Finally, in November 2024, his pleas were heard. The US, which is the single largest donor of military aid to Ukraine at over $60 billion, authorized Ukraine to fire American-supplied long-range missiles at targets inside Russia. Other key Western allies quickly followed suit, including the governments of the UK and France. This move begs the question, why now? Are Zelensky's pleas truly what prevailed, or is there something more strategic at play? The answer leads toward the second option. You see, the authorization from the US came after two major events. The first was the reported deployment of North Korean troops in Russia's Kursk region. This deployment marked a major escalation in the Russo-Ukrainian war, as it was the first time foreign troops were officially sent to bolster Russia's failing war effort. Some 11,000 North Korean soldiers have reportedly been transported across Siberia to Kursk, following orders from the country's supreme leader Kim Jong-un to aid Putin. Alongside them are several North Korean generals, artillery, and BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers. These troops were initially believed to be infantry only, but intelligence now shows that North Korean elite troops might be involved, making their presence even more alarming. Most of the troops are still preparing for combat, which will become important later on in the video. They're currently training with Russia's naval infantry and the Russian Airborne Forces (VDV), specifically the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 11th and 83rd VDV brigades. These same units are already active in combat operations in Kursk, and many of the North Korean troops are expected to join them on the front lines soon. This puts Ukraine's November 20th strike into perspective, as the facility targeted reportedly hosted numerous North Korean soldiers at the time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's break down the second event that might have prompted President Joe Biden to finally give the long-awaited green light: President Donald Trump's re-election on November 5, 2024. You see, Trump has already stated his intention to end the war in Ukraine, but he didn't elaborate on how. What he did do was criticize the billions of dollars in aid sent to Ukraine under Biden, which immediately raised concerns in Kyiv among Ukraine's allies. Trump's skepticism about continued military support has left many wondering if his administration would scale back or even cut off the aid that's been crucial to Ukraine's defense. This uncertainty has spurred both Ukraine and Russia into action. Kyiv knows it must solidify its position while it can still count on unwavering Western support. Meanwhile, Moscow likely sees Trump's return as an opportunity to push for peace talks from a position of strength, which explains the urgency of taking back Kursk. The uncertainty over Trump's moves likely pushed Biden to greenlight long-range strikes into Russia, allowing Ukraine to inflict maximum damage on Russian forces and infrastructure while it still can. With any luck, Ukraine could seriously reshape the battlefield before Trump's inauguration on January 20, 2025. And Storm Shadow missiles will surely be part of these efforts. With this in mind, let's get to know these missiles a little better before discussing their first monumental deployment inside Russia. Storm Shadow is an Anglo-French long-range cruise missile designed to strike high-value, stationary targets deep behind enemy lines. How deep? Try 155 miles away. That's how deep. This impressive range allows Ukraine to strike critical Russian infrastructure, even in the heart of Russia itself. The Storm Shadow missiles are launched from military aircraft and fly at nearly the speed of sound, Mach 0.95, hugging the terrain to avoid detection before diving to strike its target with devastating force. The avoiding detection part is also one of the Storm Shadow's most notable features. Even the most sophisticated air defense systems are no match for this missile, which likely explains why Ukraine was able to land multiple Storm Shadows on Russian territory. Remember, Russia has always presented its air defense systems as nearly impenetrable. From the latest S-500 systems to a variety of layered defensive measures, Moscow has poured billions into securing its skies. And yet, here we are. Storm Shadow has proven highly effective at evading Russian defenses due to the missile's advanced guidance system, which combines GPS, inertial navigation, infrared imaging, and terrain referencing. This highly specialized weapon has been used against Russia on a few occasions, making it nothing short of a nightmare for the Russian troops. In September 2023, 3 of the 10 Storm Shadow missiles hit Sevastopol's Black Sea fleet port, delivering a massive blow to Russia's naval power. The missiles tore into the Rostov-na-Donu submarine and the Rapucha-class landing ship Minsk, seriously crippling Russia's fleet. The damage was so severe that reports claimed Minsk was beyond repair. According to Ukraine, this attack also killed 62 Russian personnel, many of whom were aboard Minsk, as the ship was scheduled to depart for combat duty a day later. Another devastating blow to Russia's military came less than 10 days later, when at least 3 Storm Shadows hit the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, killing 34 Russian officers and wounding at least another 100 personnel. The fatalities included some of Russia's top brass. Of course, this was no coincidence, as Ukraine purposefully targeted a meeting of the Russian Navy's leadership in Sevastopol. There were even claims that the commander of the Black Sea Fleet at the time, Viktor Sokolov, was among the victims. However, there are still conflicting reports on whether Sokolov was actually killed in the strike or not. If he was, he wouldn't be the first high-ranking Russian to be taken out by Storm Shadows. In June 2023, a Storm Shadow missile played a pivotal role in eliminating Major General Sergei Gerachev, the Chief of Staff of Russia's 35th Combined Arms Army. This brings us to the most devastating Storm Shadow strike, which also claimed the life of a Russian general. The November 20th strike this video is all about. Now, before we break down this strike, keep one thing in mind. This attack is still fairly fresh, which translates to a whirlwind of conflicting reports surrounding it. But even though the fog of war is still thick, we'll do our best to piece together the most credible accounts for you. It doesn't help that Ukraine has been pretty vague about the specifics, with senior military sources only labeling the strike as very successful. This is pretty much on par with Zelensky's comments made after the US allowed deep strikes into Russia's territory. The Ukrainian president did say that the missiles would speak for themselves. As for us, we'll rely on multiple reports to fill in the blanks. Let's start with the target of the November 20th attack. The target of the strike was reportedly a high-value, fortified command post, exactly the kind of facility that Storm Shadow missiles are designed to annihilate. You see, this missile is crafted to penetrate hardened bunkers and underground military structures and devastate them with an 880-pound warhead. This makes it ideal for targeting the command centers and ammo depots Russia has relied on throughout the conflict. And that's exactly what happened on November 20th. According to multiple sources, including a Russian blogger, the missile struck a key command post in the Kursk region. The exact target of the attack was likely an underground military facility located in Marino, a town historically tied to Tsarist Russia, some 25 miles from the border with Ukraine. According to the reports, this facility, the Russian Presidential Affairs Directorate, was used as a command center for the North Korean forces in Russia. These forces were part of the 50,000 troops ordered to reclaim Kursk by attacking the Ukrainian-held 250 square mile salient in the region. As mentioned, the timing of the permission to target Russian soil was no coincidence. The same goes for the choice of the target. A Ukrainian official even hinted that this strike was part of a broader series of operations targeting North Korean positions in the Kursk region, which had been scattered across the area. This particular hit, however, appears to be the most significant one, as it strikes at the heart of the North Korean operations in the region. So it shouldn't be surprising that Ukraine went all out on this strike. It wasn't just a single Storm Shadow missile. It was a coordinated attack in tandem with drones and rockets meant to confuse and overwhelm enemy defenses. So how many Storm Shadows are we talking about? The numbers vary, but the most widely reported figure is 10 Storm Shadow missiles. This is no small number considering that each missile costs at least $1 million and is only used for high-value targets. According to the Two Majors Telegram channel, a prominent pro-Russian channel, as many as 12 Storm Shadows were launched into the Kursk region. The channel even posted images of missile debris with the name Storm Shadow clearly visible. Adding to the confusion were reports from some Russian war correspondents that they heard at least 14 explosions, many of which were preceded by the distinct sound of incoming missiles. Videos from Telegram show black smoke rising above a residential area, confirming the severity of the attack. But how was this attack carried out? Some reports suggest the strike may have involved a record 5 Ukrainian Su-24 bombers, each armed with 2 Storm Shadows. These bombers were reportedly modified by Ukrainian forces, with foreign assistance, to launch the British Storm Shadows and their French counterparts, Scalp EGs. This time, the bombers alone reportedly carried 10 Storm Shadow missiles, with possibly more launched from other platforms. The Kremlin made no comment on the exact number of Storm Shadows launched, but it did claim that the Russian air defenses shot down 2. And that's not all. According to Russia's Ministry of Defense, 6 HIMARS and 67 unmanned aerial vehicles were also neutralized by the country's air defense systems. Even if this is the case, it's obvious that the Russian forces failed to prevent the main event, the event that reportedly took out several military personnel in the process. Many experts theorize that this was precisely the reason for that attack. Similar to the September 2023 Storm Shadow strike, a gathering of senior command staff was the actual target, but this time the Russian officers were joined by North Korean military personnel. Let's tally up the damage. First, the North Korean troops. Sources are inconsistent, but it's widely reported that around 500 North Korean soldiers were killed in the strike. If 11,000 North Korean troops truly arrived in Russia, this means that the Storm Shadows took out almost 5% of them. But the soldiers weren't the only ones affected by this attack. As mentioned, the true target was the higher-ranking officials. Allegedly, a senior North Korean general was injured in the November 20 strike. The Wall Street Journal cited Western officials who confirmed the general's injury, though details about his condition remain scarce. The same applies to the identity of this general. Although his name hasn't been officially disclosed, there are speculations that it might have been Colonel General Kim Jong-bok, who was sent to oversee the North Korean Special Forces units deployed in Russia. Regardless of who the senior official was, Ukraine made one thing clear: no North Korean personnel supporting Russia will be spared. As the US National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby has put it, all North Korean troops are fair game and fair targets for Ukrainian troops, regardless of their rank. As for the Russians, at least 18 soldiers were reportedly killed in the attack, while another 33 personnel were wounded. Among the dead were not just rank-and-file soldiers, but key officers from the southern and eastern military districts, territories closely tied to the Russian war effort in Ukraine. But the real tragedy for Russians, of course, was the reported death of Lieutenant General Valery Solodchuk, the commander of the 36th Combined Arms Army. Reports from multiple sources indicate that Solodchuk was among those killed in the strike, though his death hasn't been definitively confirmed. For now, it was believed that he was definitely at the headquarters at the time of the missile strike. But who even is Valery Solodchuk? Well, his background paints a chilling portrait of his involvement in Russia's aggressive military campaigns. Born in 1971, Solodchuk had a long career steeped in bloodshed and controversy. He played a direct role in the Battle of Kyiv at the start of Russia's invasion in February 2022, leading his forces from Belarus to attempt an encirclement of the Ukrainian capital. The operation was a catastrophic failure, with the Russian 36th Army repelled by Ukrainian forces. His leadership during this operation earned him little more than contempt from his subordinates, as evidenced by an audio recording from May 2022 where Solodchuk was heard threatening to kill his own soldiers after they refused his orders to attack. Clearly, his idea of leadership was more about intimidation than inspiration. However, Solodchuk's involvement in Ukraine stretches back even further. His participation in the 2014-15 invasion of Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region, is well documented. His actions during this period are widely regarded as part of Russia's war crimes during the early stages of the conflict, with many alleging that his forces were directly involved in human rights abuses against civilians. At the time, Solodchuk commanded the 7th Air Assault Division, which was responsible for the deployment of Russian troops and artillery in eastern Ukraine. His subsequent promotion to lieutenant general was tied directly to his participation in Ukraine's occupation, cementing his legacy as a central figure in the Russian military's war of aggression. This makes Solodchuk's loss no small matter for the Russian command structure. By taking out a symbol of Russia's brutal, unprovoked aggression, Ukraine let the world know that Russia's most notorious war criminals are no longer immune to justice. And that's precisely what this attack was: justice, rather than an execution of the defenseless, as one Russian blogger absurdly put it. Russian statements on the matter didn't mention Solodchuk. In fact, Putin claimed that no commanders were even injured in the strike. Putin's exact words were, "The command and operational staff of the control center suffered no casualties." Putin added that this staff continues to manage effectively the operations of Russian forces to eliminate and push enemy units out of the Kursk region. However, Putin did confirm that there were casualties in the attack. In his words, "The attack and subsequent air defense battle resulted in casualties, both fatalities and injuries, among the perimeter security units and servicing staff." But as you might expect, in reality, Putin didn't take this devastating strike quite so lightly. His response came quickly and forcefully. Almost immediately after the Ukrainian strike, Putin claimed that Russian forces delivered a counterstrike targeting Ukraine's defense industry. This is hardly surprising, as Russia has frequently targeted Ukraine's industrial heartland in Dnipro and other areas as part of its strategy to cripple Ukraine's ability to fight back. But Putin wasn't done yet. In a highly publicized move, Putin announced the introduction of a new medium-range hypersonic missile, the Oreshnik. Putin said that the tests of the missile were successful, further elaborating on how it would be a game-changer for Russia. Supposedly, the Oreshnik can hit targets with unmatched speed, traveling at Mach 10, or around 7,000 miles per hour. According to Putin, none of the air defense systems currently available in the world is powerful enough to intercept such a weapon. As if that wasn't enough, Putin also issued a barrage of threats. Staying true to his usual ways, Putin also included nuclear retaliation in these threats. He changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to make it possible for Russia to target military facilities in countries that allow Ukraine to strike Russian territory. He specifically referenced the UK and the US, suggesting that their use of long-range missiles in Ukraine could provoke an aggressive response from Russia. Of course, this is by no means surprising, as Putin has long made it clear he considered the use of Western-supplied long-range weapons an escalation of the conflict. After the November 20th strike, he once again reiterated his stance that the West was the one to instigate the war in Ukraine, and it's the one keeping it alive. You see, according to Putin, there's no way Ukrainian forces could use the Storm Shadow missiles independently. Experts are well aware, he proclaimed, that the use of such weapons is not possible without the direct involvement of military experts from the manufacturing nations. Here, Putin was, of course, not so subtly, alluding to the idea that the West is directly involved in the conflict by enabling Ukraine's strikes deep into Russian territory. This is the same tired line Putin has used to justify his invasion of Ukraine in the first place, blaming the West for everything from his aggression to the sanctions he's facing. It's a scapegoating tactic that he's used time and time again to rally the Russian populace and deflect blame from the invasion's failures. Now, Putin's threats might sound intimidating, but there's a fatal flaw in his approach. These threats are mostly empty. Western officials have consistently downplayed Russia's nuclear saber-rattling, with CIA Director Bill Burns even calling Putin a bully who will continue to saber-rattle from time to time. Despite his threats, Ukraine continues to receive Western support both militarily and economically. The UK has made it abundantly clear that its support for Ukraine won't be deterred by Putin's irresponsible rhetoric, as the country's defense minister called it. In fact, the UK has recently boosted Kyiv's arsenal of Storm Shadows. According to a Bloomberg report, dozens of Storm Shadows have already been delivered to Ukraine, marking the first major arms transfer under the UK's new Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The country has also pledged to deliver more. And that's precisely what Ukraine needs for a true impact on the battlefield. More long-range missiles, more Storm Shadows. But can Storm Shadows alone make a difference? The short answer is no. While the Storm Shadow missiles are incredibly effective, they can't single-handedly change the war's trajectory, especially when you consider the fact that Moscow hadn't been idle either. Before the permission to use these missiles even came, Russia had already adjusted its position. Bombers, missiles, and critical infrastructure have been relocated deeper into Russian territory, placing them beyond Storm Shadow's range. So while Ukraine now has the capability to strike up to 225 Russian bases identified by analysts as within range, the impact may be limited by Moscow's countermeasures. Even so, Storm Shadows still have immense strategic benefits. They force the Russian military to operate from greater distances, increasing their logistical costs and reducing the efficiency of air support and command operations. Additionally, the challenge of defending such a vast territory stretches Russian air defenses thin, creating vulnerabilities that Ukraine's drones and other munitions can exploit. This added complexity severely disrupts Russia's ability to manage its war effort. With this in mind, where do you think Ukraine will strike next? Also, will the British Storm Shadows and the American ATACMS missiles continue leading the charge? Or will they be joined by other advanced long-range missiles? Will the German Taurus missiles, which the country's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has previously vehemently refused to send, suddenly become available? Also, do you see Russia striking back harder than it already has? On October 23rd, South Korean intelligence spotted over 3,000 North Korean troops moving into Russia. A few days later, Ukrainian intelligence claimed the real number was closer to 10,000. But fast forward a month, and Ukraine's FPV drones gave the world a front row seat to the chaos. and the North Koreans weren't ready for it. Armed with explosives and unmatched speed, these drones turned the battlefield into a nightmare for North Korean troops. Tanks were obliterated, infantry scattered in panic, and soldiers threw their weapons in a desperate attempt to stop the drones. The result? A one-sided bloodbath. How did North Korea's troops end up so badly outclassed? And what was Vladimir Putin thinking when he called them into the fight? Let's dive into how North Koreans ended up in Russia in the first place, and why they're no match for Ukraine's drone warfare. Russia ostensibly used its long-term alliance with North Korea to sign a defense pact in June 2024. While the pact itself was only ratified in mid-November, it would seem that its effects have already started to take hold in Russia's favor. The exact wording of the defense pact, which was publicly released by North Korean media shortly after the initial signing, indicated that both countries would be obligated to come to the other's defense if their territory was being directly threatened. Whether it was by design or sheer coincidence, Russia got the justification to call on their North Korean allies just a few months after the pact was signed. With their invasion of Kursk, the Ukrainian military stepped foot in Russian territory for the first time during the war. While the initial response from the Kremlin was relatively muted and often contradictory, the Russian government immediately started calling Ukrainians terrorists and claimed that this constituted a direct violation of Russia's territorial integrity. While the rest of the world pondered the hypocrisy of the claim, Putin wasted no time in trying to bully Ukraine and NATO as much as possible. The fact that Ukraine invaded Russia represented a crossing of one of Russia's infamous red lines, which would theoretically allow Russia to respond to conventional warfare with nuclear weapons if they considered it justification. Of course, August saw no nuclear response, but plenty of threats to do so if Ukraine didn't retreat. When Ukraine continued its slow but sure advance deeper into Kursk, NATO realized that Putin's threats about that particular red line were nothing but hot air. In turn, the alliance redoubled its efforts to provide more effective military equipment to Ukraine. A month after the Kursk invasion, Russia started its counteroffensive. But considering that the bulk of Russia's efforts were focused on the long-term front line in Donbass, they would have to divest some of their troops from the front and use them in Kursk. On paper, Russia still maintained a healthy numerical advantage over Ukraine and could, in theory, fight on both fronts at once. Realistically, the front in Donbass had practically stalled by August, with Russia being hard-pressed to send more forces to make any progress. This resulted in the counteroffensive in Kursk needing different resources, something that wouldn't cost Russia as much as sending experienced contract soldiers to the region. One of the first options, conscripts, was unlikely. This was because conscripts were partially responsible for the Kursk invasion getting as far as it did. With a lack of general training, equipment, and precise orders, the Russian conscripts that were stationed in Kursk when the invasion started simply retreated or surrendered before the oncoming Ukrainians. The Ukrainian prisons responsible for processing captured Russian soldiers stated that a vast majority of conscripts reported that they had received only a few weeks of training and basic equipment. The interviews also indicated that Russia never believed that Ukraine would actually be bold enough to invade, which partially explained the extent of the Kursk invasion's success in a mere 3 weeks. This meant that Russia needed another avenue for getting soldiers cheaply and in high numbers. And lo and behold, the North Korean government just happened to sign a defense pact. So North Korea ended up sending at least 10,000 soldiers, mainly to the Kursk region. Later reports suggested that the actual number of soldiers could be between 11 and 12,000, with some outlets indicating that this would be only the first of a few waves of North Koreans going to Russia to bolster the military numbers. However, the actual state of those soldiers is likely to be insufficient for Russia's goals. You see, North Korea is one of the most military-oriented countries in the world. All men are required to serve in the army for 8 years, and all women have to serve for 5 years. Overall, North Korea, a country with roughly 26 million people, has a standing army of around 1.3 million, which is roughly tied for the fourth largest army in the world by active manpower, after India and China, both nations which have around 1.4 billion residents. Additionally, the lengthy military service results in significant reservist forces, with estimates that North Korea can conscript around 8 million soldiers in the state of active war. And yet those soldiers are considered significantly subpar compared to other nations. The key here is the fact that North Korea is practically isolated geopolitically, and its armed forces are using training methods that are widely obsolete. The last time North Korea was active in conflict was in 1953, when the Korean War stopped and the Korean Demilitarized Zone was established. The North Korean army is ostensibly using tactics and strategies that could be only decades away from that. This is further supported by the state of North Korean military equipment. Most, if not all of North Korea's equipment came from the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. Soviet designs such as the T-55 and T-62s, which were designed back in the 50s and 60s, and still comprise the bulk of the armed forces' main battle tanks. Similar sentiments apply to the country's artillery equipment and aircraft, all of which harken back to the time when the Soviet Union was designing them. Of course, that means that North Koreans have been extensively trained in using old equipment, something that might actually work in Russia's favor. With Russia suffering heavy losses of its more modern armor, reports keep surfacing about the country pulling old tanks out of storage to hastily retrofit them with slightly newer pieces and ship them to the front. In these cases, North Koreans could have some semblance of competence when using these weapons. Additionally, the Russian artillery advantage directly relies on North Korea in a way. South Korean reports from early 2024 suggested that North Korea had sent an estimated 9 million artillery rounds to Russia over the previous 6 months. The artillery rounds themselves aren't really obsolete, as the Russian military still relies on Soviet-era howitzers alongside more modern self-propelled artillery, which could in theory use the same ammo. But there are a few difficulties that North Koreans are facing in Kursk, the first being a lack of knowledge and awareness of Russian forces and a general language barrier. Ukrainian intelligence has reported that Russian soldiers have been complaining that North Koreans could neither speak Russian nor English, instead relying on dedicated interpreters or higher officers for more advanced commands. This means that in actual combat, the Russian military has relatively little control over the North Korean parts of its regiments, relying on simple phrases that could lead to significant strategic misses. Additionally, North Korean defectors who live in South Korea but served in the North Korean army sometime in the past few decades suggest that the image of North Korean soldiers is significantly warped from reality. According to interviews with these defectors, the North Korean military suffers from widespread food shortages and basic equipment shortages and has likely been decimated by the COVID pandemic in recent years. Therefore, it's not a particular surprise that Russia has been sending vital food products to North Korea in exchange for the previously mentioned artillery rounds. Even the current North Korean soldiers in Kursk are basically a source of income for the North Korean government. While they technically are earning the average Russian soldier salary, around $2,000 per month, it's posited that 80 to 90% of that goes directly to the government rather than the soldier or their family, although some experts and former soldiers say that money will go to the North Korean state. But arguably the most significant disadvantage that these soldiers have compared to Russian and Ukrainian troops is the aforementioned lack of modern military tactics. North Korea has practically no experience with electronic and technological warfare, with few reports of international exercises with either China or Russia. This is particularly notable in light of the aforementioned drone warfare. Ukraine has advanced the concept of using commercial drones for military purposes for at least a few years, with multiple types of drones all seamlessly used together to create an overwhelmingly robust remote-controlled army. The first-person view drones, such as the ones being used to hunt down Russian and North Korean troops in Kursk, are only one of the offensive approaches that the Ukrainian military is using. The drones being used here are typically low-cost, high-adaptability models. The Ukrainian and Russian army can take a small commercial drone, like the one used for photo shoots, video making, or even dedicated drone races, and outfit it with a larger battery, better camera, and some sort of weapon. Then the drone is remotely controlled, in a manner similar to a video game, allowing soldiers to pilot the drone with minimal additional training. In fact, it's argued that the Ukrainian military has called on gamers to become drone operators, as the core skill set, such as reaction speed and hand-eye coordination, transfers pretty seamlessly between the platforms. The drones, being remote-controlled, shore up one of the few weaknesses of artillery: accuracy. While modern artillery can fire rounds extremely quickly, there's still a chance that it misses the target. On the other hand, drones remain fully in control of the operator from the moment they take off to the moment their ordnance is detonated, barring electronic interference. But the real reason why FPV drones have managed to practically dominate the battlefield is their inherent disposability. The cost of the parts is typically negligible compared to the damage the drones can do. For example, a cheap commercial drone can cost at most a few $1,000s for a high-end model, typically with a longer range and a better camera. The ordnance is often salvaged from artillery ammunition, with the cost only based on the work required to extract the explosive and fit it in a different detonation system. Alternatively, larger drones can be equipped with anti-tank mines. The anti-tank mines in question are often the Soviet-era TM-62, which have been photographed arriving in truckloads to the front lines, making them relatively easy and cheap to procure. This means that a single kamikaze drone can cost less than $5,000, something that the US is struggling to achieve with modern military-grade single-use weaponry. On the other hand, a modern tank like the T-90 can cost upward of $4.5 million to make. Infantry support and transport vehicles often cost in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Small, cheap drones taking out a vital piece of Russian military equipment en masse are also effectively waging an economic war on Russia. It's part of the reason why the most recent Russian tanks, the T-14 Armatas, were only deployed in Ukraine for mere weeks before being pulled The cheap, mobile, and expendable nature of the drones meant that Ukrainians could stand to launch dozens of them each day. If 1 in 10 reaches a target and 1 in 50 actually destroys a tank, that's still hundreds of thousands of dollars that Russia has lost. And the FPV drones can be deadly against infantry as well. A grenade or artillery round doesn't have to hit a human directly to kill them. Oftentimes, the detonation radius of a dozen feet is enough to kill or severely injure a soldier, and modern squad-based tactics, particularly the ones used by Russia and North Korea, mean that soldiers are unlikely to be alone. Therefore, a single drone can be easily used to take out multiple troops simultaneously, all the while transmitting vital tactical information back to the Ukrainian army. This is exactly what's been happening in the videos shown by Ukrainian intelligence and social media. But the FPV drones are only part of the equation. Ukraine also uses various drones for surveillance and range extension. These larger drones are often custom-made, based on larger agricultural and transport drones that are widely available on the market, particularly from China. With the ability to hover hundreds of meters above ground, the drones provide a real-time bird's-eye view of the surroundings. Meanwhile, the FPV drones are deployed to hunt down the targets in sight. By combining long-range and short-range surveillance capabilities of the drones, the Ukrainian army can create significant pressure on the ground without risking any of its forces. Granted, Russia has also co-opted similar technology, and the drone war has effectively made operators much more lucrative and vital for military operations than practically any other type of soldier. In some cases, the effectiveness of a drone operator squad is so great that the militaries create dedicated hunting missions to eliminate them. One such mission was aimed at taking out the famous Moisey or Moses, a Russian drone operating squad commander who was responsible for Ukraine losing over 400 soldiers and 50 vehicles. The mission's success was widely celebrated by the Ukrainian army and allowed it to stave off the Russian advance in the region for a few days, since the former's land forces could take more favorable defensive positions. The threat of drone warfare on North Korean troops was estimated to be significant, with Ukrainian intelligence reporting that they expect a 90% casualty rate for North Koreans deployed in Kursk. That means that out of the 11,000 soldiers that should hit the front lines in the region within a few weeks, only slightly more than 1,000 would survive the next few months. The high casualty rate is only expected to rise in the coming weeks, as Russia in general has been losing more and more soldiers each month. For example, September was considered one of the deadliest months of the war at that point, being the 5th consecutive month when the daily casualty rate for Russians exceeded 1,200 soldiers. Then October came and shattered the record, with the Russian army losing over 1,500 soldiers on most of the days. And those 2 months were before the North Korean soldiers actually started fighting with the Russians. While the Ukrainian intelligence suggested that the troops were present in Kursk as early as October 16th, it's assumed that most of the soldiers needed to undergo weeks or possibly months of extra training. That's a significant amount of time for the Russian military to only use whatever soldiers it has at its disposal, considering the accelerating rate of losses it's incurring. On one hand, that means Russia is desperate for the North Korean soldiers to enter the fray. By deploying these soldiers in Kursk, the bulk of the Russian army could remain on the main front line in Donbass. The Donbass front line has seen increased fighting and some success for the Russian army over the past few months. Somewhat surprisingly, the Russian forces have managed to push deeper into Ukrainian territory since September, taking as much territory in 3 months as they did in the preceding 7. The increased tempo of the Donbass front line mainly stems from Russia redoubling its efforts to use long-range missiles and drones in Ukrainian cities or on supply lines, putting more pressure on the frontline forces. The presence of North Korean troops in Kursk should, on paper, give Ukraine a slightly harder time. The occupied territory in Kursk is a vital bargaining chip that Ukraine relies on. Not only has it allowed NATO to renew military aid packages and start donating more advanced weaponry, but Ukraine could use the territory as leverage in peace deals. This last part is vital, as previous peace proposals have been heavily in Russia's favor. For example, China proposed that Russia keep whatever territory it's occupied, which at that point was roughly 18% of Ukraine's land. But with Ukraine holding some of Russia's territory, it signifies that its army could, in theory, create more pressure for a large-scale operation of surrounding regions. It would be a clear signal that Putin's army is nowhere near as powerful as it seems, which could end up prolonging the war to the point that NATO might decide to bring increasingly potent equipment for Ukraine to use. Additionally, both sides in the war are somewhat on a deadline. The 2024 US presidential elections were won by former President Donald Trump, who had previously expressed a positive disposition toward Russia and North Korea, and a negative one toward NATO. The inauguration day is scheduled for January 20th, meaning that the current administration of President Joe Biden has only several weeks to create as much impact as possible in Ukraine. However, the situation in the war is not as black and white as it first seems. Trump's favoritism toward Putin was primarily based on the fact that Russia had geopolitical and economic leverage and influence. But after the war in Ukraine started and Russia began suffering heavy losses, this might no longer be true, or at least true enough for Trump. Additionally, Trump was critical of NATO members refusing to allocate enough of a budget for their national militaries. While this was true in 2020, when most of NATO was under the recommended 2% of GDP for national defense, most countries have actually stepped up their contributions. Furthermore, Central European countries such as Poland and Germany have created long-term plans to significantly increase their army presence. Finland and Sweden have also joined the alliance in the meantime, heavily boosting the alliance's economic and military potential, considering that both countries have modern weapon research capabilities and Finland has allowed the US to use its military bases. All of these factors mean that there's no telling what Trump might do in regard to current policies that allow Ukraine to be fueled by NATO weapons. The territory in Kursk is one of Putin's greatest weaknesses, and he might decide to speed up the war or use significant firepower to retake it. Which brings us back to the North Korean troops. It's obvious that they are one of the linchpins of the entire Kursk operation. Without those 11,000 soldiers, Russia could stand to lose a significant number of contract soldiers and its conscripts without gaining much in return. Losing contract soldiers directly lowers the military's effectiveness on the Donbass front, which would allow Ukraine to slowly start retaking territory there. Losing conscripts en masse could mean additional rounds of military conscription throughout the country, further straining the country's economy and industries. The latter is vital because Russia is slowly running out of manpower to use in the war. Eventually, this could mean that the army would be forced to start conscripting from richer population centers. Not only would this cripple the local industries, it would shatter the Kremlin's propaganda on the current war effort. Oligarchs who support Putin might start working against him. It could also mean that the general population might start posing a more severe threat to the current regime. Both of them could end up threatening to oust Putin from the seat of power, which could have devastating consequences for the country's relations with China and North Korea, since they're predicated on Putin remaining president. Therefore, Russia is in significant danger. Its efforts in Kursk rely heavily on North Korean soldiers, who are nowhere near ready or trained to take on Ukraine, especially when accounting for the technological and tactical disparity between their armies. With Putin rushing to retake Kursk before the January 20th deadline, it would mean that the soldiers could get deployed with relatively little training, further cementing their fates. Those 11,000 soldiers will essentially end up as target practice for Ukraine, as the earlier videos have shown. Do you think North Korea will send even more soldiers to Russia? How do you mark the 1,000th day of a war that has devastated your country? If you're Ukraine, you waste no time at all in taking advantage of the United States finally permitting you to use its long-range missiles against your enemy. On November 19th, Ukraine launched a volley of ATACMS missiles at Russia, absolutely obliterating everything that lay in the missile's path. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has just sent a clear message to Russia. We finally got what we wanted all along, and we're not afraid to use it. ATACMS missiles are going to fly, and there are dozens of key Russian positions within their range. This first strike is just the start, as Ukraine plans to turn so many of Russia's most important strategic locations into fiery pits on the ground. Happy 1,000-day anniversary. Here we're going to share all of the details about Ukraine's ATACMS missile strike, including what happened and what it means for the future of the war. We'll also detail the Russian response to both the strike and the news that the US has finally permitted Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russian territory. We start with what actually happened. On November 18th, news emerged that US President Joe Biden had finally permitted Ukraine to use long-range ATACMS, which is a missile system, on Russian territory. The missiles present a clear threat to Putin's plan for Ukraine. Assuming Ukraine has received the modern Block 1A variant of the missile system, it's now capable of striking up to around 186 miles inside Russian territory. Each ATACMS can be loaded with a high explosive or blast fragmentation warhead, the latter breaking up into 950 sub-munitions, and can move at speeds in excess of Mach 3 in the air. Worse yet for Russia, the missiles are road mobile. That means Ukraine can transport them to anywhere in its territory before firing them at a target. November 19th brought with it the first use of what is sure to be many displays of the ATACMS' devastating power. The BBC was among the first to write a report on the Ukraine missile strike. It says US officials confirmed that Ukraine had launched an ATACMS strike within the Bryansk region that borders Ukraine to its north. If that region sounds familiar, it's because Ukraine tried to breach the region's borders in October 2024, just a few short months after its soldiers had taken territory in Kursk. Ukraine has definitely made Bryansk a target, not least because it hosts an airfield from which Russia can launch glide bombs and provides a potential route into its territory for Russian soldiers. The fact that Bryansk neighbors Kursk also isn't lost on Ukraine. The region is likely part of a supply chain that's feeding equipment to the 50,000 soldiers Russian President Vladimir Putin is using in his ongoing Kursk counteroffensive. But back to the ATACMS missiles. News of exactly what the strike hit was sketchy early on. The BBC reports that Russia's defense ministry claimed that Ukraine had fired 5 ATACMS, 4 of which were shot down before reaching their targets. The one that got through didn't score a direct hit, according to Russia, but fragments from the missile caused a fire at a military facility. That Russian report is typically minimalistic in the sense that it's trying to downplay the damage caused. According to US officials who confirmed the missile strike for the BBC, Ukraine had actually fired 8 missiles, with Russia only managing to take out 2 of them while they were en route. AP News followed up on those official claims. One of the officials said that the United States was still trying to assess the damage that Ukraine caused. However, early signs suggest that the missiles touched down on an ammo depot located in Karachev, which is a city of around 18,000 people in the Bryansk region. As for Ukraine, it remained tight-lipped on the whole matter. Zelensky was quizzed about the missile strike during a news conference in its aftermath, but wouldn't confirm whether Ukraine had used ATACMS. Instead, he hinted that it had, stating, "Ukraine has long-range capabilities, including domestically produced long-range drones, and now we have ATACMS as well." A cagey response from the president, but it's certainly no outright denial that Ukraine took full advantage of the US lifting restrictions on ATACMS usage on the war's 1000th anniversary. Zelensky's mention of drones seems to stem from the fact that Ukraine accompanied its ATACMS strike with a concerted drone assault. Reuters reported that Russia claims to have shot down 42 Ukrainian drones on the same evening that the ATACMS strike took place, with 32 of those drones being in the Bryansk region. Ukraine's tactic is made clear. It sent drones along with its missiles to confuse Russia's anti-air defenses, forcing them to focus on the less dangerous unmanned aerial vehicles ahead of the massive missiles heading Bryansk's way. Coming back to Zelensky's comments at the news conference, any doubt about Ukraine's ATACMS usage disappeared when footage of the strike started to emerge. The Warzone or TWZ's report on Ukraine's 1000-day anniversary attack offered more details, along with videos showcasing the devastation Ukraine's ATACMS caused. It noted that the specific target appeared to be Russia's 67th arsenal of the Russian Main Missile and Artillery Directorate. So Ukraine has used its ATACMS to attack Russian missile stores. TWZ also reported on videos from the strike that showed a massive fireball rising over the weapons base, followed by what sounds like a series of smaller explosions that may have been caused by ATACMS fragments detonating Russian weapons. And though Zelensky was cagey in response to the ATACMS question, his own military officials seemed to have looser tongues. Speaking to RBC Ukraine, an unnamed informed source within Ukraine's defense forces said, "Indeed, ATACMS was used for the first time to strike the territory of the Russian Federation. The strike was carried out on a facility in the Bryansk region. It was successfully destroyed." The words "successfully destroyed" indicate the strike was far more damaging than a few missile fragments causing some fires, as Russia tried to claim. More confirmation came from a different Ukrainian official who told the Washington Post that Ukraine had indeed used ATACMS to attack Bryansk in an overnight strike. So what does this 1000-day anniversary strike mean for Russia and Ukraine? In the immediate sense, Ukraine has managed to take out an ammunition depot that stored valuable weapons. Posting on the social media platform Telegram, the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council head, Andriy Kovalenko, outlined why this is a massive win for Ukraine. By taking out the ammo depot, it's destroyed artillery ammunition, air-to-ground and anti-aircraft missiles, and a slew of ammunition Russia uses in its multiple launch rocket systems. Those are all weapons that Russia can no longer use to attack Ukraine on its own territory from the supposed safety of Bryansk. They're also weapons that Russia can't ship to Kursk to support Putin's counteroffensive against the Ukrainian troops fortified within the region. In one fell swoop, Ukraine has taken out a key supply line and raised the chances of its soldiers holding out against the 50,000 Russians and North Koreans in Kursk. Taking a wider view, Ukraine launching ATACMS at Russia signifies both a change in the nature of the war and a potential escalation on both sides. That escalation started with Russia. We just mentioned that Russia is using North Korean soldiers in its Kursk counteroffensive. Those soldiers began arriving in October 2024 thanks to the well-timed Cooperative Defense Pact Putin signed with North Korean President Kim Jong-un back in June 2024. Putin had already escalated the Ukraine war to directly involve other nations before this 1000-day anniversary strike, with Biden's decision to permit ATACMS usage possibly being a reaction to North Korea's involvement. More worrying for Ukraine is another escalation pushed through by Putin in the immediate aftermath of Biden's ATACMS decision. Russian rhetoric went into overdrive as soon as the Kremlin learned that Ukraine could use long-range missiles on its territory. Putin's mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov claimed that it's clear that the outgoing administration in Washington intends to take steps to continue to add fuel to the fire and further inflame tensions around the conflict when the news of Biden's approval emerged. Russia's foreign ministry followed up, claiming that it would see any use of US-provided ATACMS on Russian territory as evidence of America's direct involvement in hostilities against the Russian Federation. Russia's response in such a case will be appropriate and palpable. Those comments laid the groundwork for Vladimir Putin's choice to make amendments to the Russian nuclear doctrine just hours before Ukraine launched its 1,000th day ATACMS strike. First proposed in September 2024, the BBC says those changes set out new conditions under which Russia could launch nuclear weapons at an opponent. Specifically, the doctrine now states that any attack conducted by a non-nuclear state, if said country is backed by a nuclear state, would be considered a joint assault against Russia. And with that attack, both states would open themselves up to a nuclear response from Russia. This represents a massive change from Russia's previous doctrine, which stated that Russia may use nuclear weapons if an enemy conducted a nuclear attack on its territory or attacked using conventional weapons that threaten the Russian Federation's existence. Putin's message with this amendment was clear. Any use of ATACMS could provoke a nuclear response from Russia on Ukraine, the United States, or both. Mere hours later, Ukraine conducted its ATACMS strike on Bryansk. Thankfully, the strike hasn't prompted an immediate nuclear retaliation from Russia, and Putin's doctrine changes haven't come as a surprise to the US State Department. Spokesman Matthew Miller said, "I'm unfortunately not surprised by the comments the Kremlin has made around the publication of this new, revised document." He points to the change as another attempt by Putin to coerce and intimidate both Ukraine and other countries around the world through irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. Washington also has no plans to change its own nuclear doctrine, which still positions nuclear weapons as a responsive measure to a nuclear attack on American soil. Still, there's no denying that Ukraine's ATACMS strike falls exactly in line with the new Russian doctrine. According to Putin's own revised version of the laws, Russia will be within its rights to respond with nuclear weapons, showing just how well-timed the doctrine amendments are. Whether he does or not remains to be seen, though the Kremlin has noted that Ukraine's strike marks a new phase of the Western war. Russia is right, and that brings us to what the future holds for the Ukraine war. On Ukraine's end, its ATACMS strike showcases that there are no restrictions on where or how it uses ATACMS on Russian territory. When news of Biden's policy reversal started filtering through, some commentators speculated that Ukraine would only be able to use the weapons in Kursk. That would have made sense. Remember that Biden's decision appears to be a direct result of Russia using North Korean soldiers in its Kursk counteroffensive. Limiting ATACMS usage to the region would have allowed the US to argue that it's only giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to defend itself from an escalation that shouldn't have happened in the first place. But Ukraine's first ATACMS strike took place in Bryansk. So that argument goes out of the window, which means more headaches than Russia might have anticipated are coming. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the range of the ATACMS means that Ukraine has the ability to strike at least 245 known Russian military objects outside of Ukraine. Among these 245 are 16 airfields, several of which are home to the aircraft Russia is using to launch glide bombs at Ukraine from behind the front lines. There are also 15 known objects in Kursk alone, though that figure seems less relevant now that it's clear Ukraine can use ATACMS to strike outside of the contested oblast. Russia now has to contend with a Ukraine that's capable of taking out key airfields, reducing Putin's use of glide bombs considerably. That's a problem for Russia. It's launched thousands of glide bombs at Ukraine because it can do so from the relative safety of its airfields behind the front lines without risking its aircraft. By taking out these aircraft with ATACMS, Ukraine will be able to relieve pressure on its soldiers on the ground, particularly in the Donbass region, which has been a key focus for Putin during much of 2024. And of course, Ukraine can cause massive disruption to Russian supply lines with ATACMS. We can see that from this first strike in Bryansk. Ukraine has targeted a specific ammunition depot to deprive Russian forces of missiles and artillery shells. Again, pressure is relieved on Ukraine, only this time the attack may help its forces in Kursk because those Bryansk weapons may have found their way into Russia's counteroffensive in the region. The point is that Ukraine can now hit far more Russian targets than it could before, and that will have Putin worried. Another concern for Putin is that the ATACMS levels the playing field in terms of the strength of the responses Ukraine can conjure to Russia's attacks. For the entire war so far, Russia has used missiles and bombs to hit Ukrainian territory without having to worry about much in the way of responses on its own land. Russia has taken advantage of that fact right up until Ukraine's Bryansk first strike. For instance, just hours before Ukraine used ATACMS in Bryansk, Russia conducted a devastating drone strike on Ukraine that left 12 people dead, including one child. It was the third such strike in as many days, with the attack, which used a Shahid drone made in Iran, also injuring 11 people, with more potentially being trapped under rubble. November 18th saw Russia fire a missile at Odessa, causing an apartment fire that killed at least 10 and injured 43, and the day before, it had fired a ballistic missile containing cluster munitions at Sumy, killing 11 and wounding 84. Here we see Russia's hypocrisy come into play. It's constantly warned Ukraine not to attack it on its own territory using weapons Ukraine has received from foreign partners, but it holds itself to no such standard. Iranian Shahid drones and North Korean artillery are regularly used to batter Ukrainian fortifications and cities. With ATACMS, Ukraine now has more options to counter these attacks on its territory. The ATACMS represents a clear threat to any Russian settlement or fortification within around 180 miles of the country's border with Ukraine. The complexion of the war changes as a result, with Putin's missiles and drone attacks on Ukrainian population centers now potentially being met in kind. All of this amounts to leverage for Ukraine. With its Kursk invasion in August 2024, Ukraine captured around 460 square miles of Russian territory. That was land that it will likely hope to use as a bargaining chip to regain some of what it's lost to Putin's special military operation should Ukraine and Russia ever come to the negotiating table. Being able to use ATACMS inside Russia and showcasing its willingness to do so grants even more leverage to Ukraine. The country can now argue that it's fully capable of retaliating to Russian strikes on its territory in kind, and its missiles can travel far enough to damage key infrastructural and military targets inside Russia. Perhaps Ukraine can use this fact to demonstrate to Putin that Bryansk is just the start. If he doesn't stop attacking Ukraine, then more ATACMS strikes on his territory will follow. All of this remains to be seen. However, maintaining that sort of leverage depends on Ukraine keeping its ability to use ATACMS in Russia when the US presidency transitions to Donald Trump in January 2025. There's no guarantee of that happening. The immediate Republican response to Biden's decision to permit ATACMS usage inside Russia was muted at best. TWZ reports that Trump's national security advisor Mike Waltz has criticized the decision. Waltz, a former National Guard colonel and Green Beret, who is now a Florida congressman, described Biden's decision as another step up the escalation ladder. Considering Waltz is likely to become a national security advisor under Trump's presidency, these responses would suggest that the incoming administration is already considering reversing Biden's decision. That would be damaging to Ukraine in the context of allowing it to use ATACMS strikes as leverage against Russia, but the reversal may come amidst President-elect Trump's push for peace with the plan he said he'll introduce when he enters office. Perhaps Ukraine struck so quickly in Bryansk because it's uncertain whether it'll have permission to use ATACMS in Russia for more than a couple of months. Again, we can't say for certain. And we also can't ignore the fact that Biden's permission does appear to have escalated the Ukraine war. Nuclear weapons are now on the table for Russia. Granted, it's threatened nuclear action plenty of times in the past as a response to Ukraine and its partners crossing red lines in the war. But this time, it's changed its nuclear doctrine to allow itself to retaliate to an attack, just like the one Ukraine conducted in Bryansk. So Ukraine has absolutely obliterated a Russian ammunition depot on the 1000th day of the war. It's proven that it's willing to use long-range missiles it's craved for so long right off the bat. But the 1000-day anniversary also marks the point where Russia's nuclear doctrine has changed, marking a turning point in the war on both sides of the conflict. Does that turning point favor Ukraine or Russia? We'll leave the answer to that question up to you. Is Russia's alteration of its doctrine just another example of the nuclear saber-rattling we've seen throughout the war? How much damage do you think Ukraine can do beyond the Bryansk strike in the months to come? Putin has done the unthinkable. After spending most of his special military operation decrying the very possibility that other countries might enter Ukraine to support his enemy, he's turned around and done exactly the same thing. The US Department of Defense says there are now between 11,000 and 12,000 North Korean soldiers inside Russia. Most of those are part of the 50,000-strong counteroffensive Russia has launched in Kursk, marking the point where the Ukraine war became truly international. This isn't Russia versus Ukraine anymore. It's Ukraine taking on Russia and North Korea. Putin, your hypocrisy is showing. Still, Ukraine hasn't cowered away from the prospect of facing off against soldiers from two countries at once. Far from it. Ukraine has a plan to deal with the North Koreans. a plan to hit them where it hurts and obliterate any chance North Korea has of aiding Russia as Putin tries to take over Ukraine. Phase 1 of that plan is complete. Ukraine just scored a pair of major victories against the North Korean forces by taking out crucial ammo stockpiles that were supposed to keep those soldiers stocked up as they fought against Ukraine. In this video, we're going to share all of the details of Ukraine's latest brave moves and what they'll mean for Putin's special military operation moving forward. We start with a question. Just what has Ukraine done to devastate the North Korean forces? Business Insider offers some details. On October 9, 2024, it reported that Ukraine had conducted a successful strike on a huge Russian ammunition depot located in the western Bryansk region. If Bryansk sounds familiar, it's because the region neighbors Kursk, some of which Ukraine has occupied since its successful August 6th invasion of Russian territory. Like Kursk, Bryansk is a potential target for a Ukrainian cross-border incursion. It's also a vital region for Putin. He needs to keep Bryansk under Russian control to enable his counteroffensive in Kursk and to provide his own troops with another route into Ukraine. But back to the Ukrainian strike. Business Insider says that Ukraine claimed to have caused significant fire damage at an ammunition depot in Bryansk. It's believed that the depot was home to Russian missiles and artillery shells. Crucially, Russia was also using it to store munitions it had received from North Korea, likely in preparation for the later arrival of North Korean soldiers. Better yet for Ukraine, the depot also held Russian glide bombs, Soviet-era mega bombs that Russia has used to devastate Ukrainian cities and towns throughout much of 2024. Video footage of the attack shows the facility, which is in the Bryansk town of Karachev, wrapped in flames as explosions ring out. The Kremlin's propaganda machine went into overdrive after the news came out. It claimed it had shot down around 24 Ukrainian drones during the attack in an attempt to show that it had thwarted Ukraine's efforts. The video proves otherwise. More details came from Al Jazeera. Its report on the attack quoted the Ukrainian General Staff as claiming that Ukraine's successful strike would cause major logistical problems for Russia in the future. The arsenal stored ammunition for missile and artillery systems, including those delivered from North Korea, as well as glide bombs, the General Staff claimed. Much of the ammunition was stored in the open. Putting aside the clear lack of care Russia takes in protecting its munitions, this last statement makes clear, the Kremlin was eventually forced to reveal that Ukraine's strike was successful. Newsweek reports that the country's Emergency Situation Ministry confirmed it had tracked explosions of explosive objects as a result of Ukraine's strike. It also noted a Russian Telegram social media channel, which claims to have links to the Kremlin, as stating that residents in Karachev saw fire and explosions of ammunition. Russia couldn't hide away from the successful strike once that information started leaking out. Ukraine had just hit it hard. In an instant, it had destroyed a valuable ammunition depot in a direct attack against Russia and North Korea. A Kyiv Post article published in the wake of the strike offers more details. It says Ukraine's target was the 67th GRAU arsenal, with GRAU standing for Main Missile and Artillery Directorate. The depot was approximately 70.8 miles away from the border, meaning Ukraine had come up with a way to strike Russian territory without any of its troops physically crossing the border. Drones were the answer. Ukraine filled the skies with drones that devastated the ammo depot, and having established the success of that approach, it prepared to do it all over again a little under a month later. Drones were the weapon of choice once again, when Ukraine followed up its October strike with a secondary attack, hitting another of Bryansk's ammunition depots. This strike was carried out using drone units that attacked the 1060th Material and Technical Support Center, with the specific target being Russia's 120th arsenal of its Main Missile and Artillery Directorate. Again, that's an arsenal that's been supplemented with North Korean weapons throughout much of 2024. Ukraine was sending a clear message to Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. We know North Korea is coming, and we're going to do everything we can to slow your soldiers down. Ukraine's General Staff provided a report into the second Bryansk ammunition storage attack. At least 8 explosions were recorded, it claims. Objective control results indicate at least 2 fire points at the military facility and signs of secondary detonations. As was the case with the October strike, Russia was forced to confirm that another one of its depots had gone up in smoke, and again it tried to twist the story. Bryansk Oblast Governor Alexander Bogomaz was typically cagey in his report on the attack, claiming, "As a result of the drone attack in Bryansk, non-residential buildings caught fire." In this case, we know that non-residential buildings translates to tons of the ammunition we received from North Korea and plan to use in our Kursk offensive. Worse yet for Russia, 120th Arsenal was a brand new depot. Militani says it was built both to store ammunition and to serve as a new plant for the repair of artillery systems. It also noted that Russia built this depot because of its proximity to a large railway junction, which would enable the easy transportation of artillery systems. That junction still stands, but Ukraine has rendered it practically useless after its second strike on the Russian and North Korean ammo depots. It all adds up to 2 devastating attacks in 2 months. But now we come to another question. What does all of this mean for Putin's plan to use North Korean soldiers in the war? It's not good news for Russia's leader. First, it's important to reiterate that Bryansk lies on the border between Russia and Ukraine. It also borders Kursk, and that positioning makes it a strategically vital location for both Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is already taking advantage of that fact. In the wake of its October 2024 strike on the Karachev depot, a small contingent of the country's soldiers reportedly attempted a cross-border incursion into Bryansk, similar to the one Ukraine carried out in Kursk. The Independent says that an armed group attempted to bypass border checkpoints to enter the Bryansk Oblast, though they were eventually beaten back. Ukraine didn't immediately acknowledge the attempt, though Bryansk's governor, Bogomaz, was quick to claim that the situation was stable and under control. That attempted border crossing perhaps shows us Ukraine's intentions with its strikes against the North Korean ammo depots. The attempted incursion occurred on October 27th. The second drone strike against a Bryansk ammo depot happened about 2 weeks later, and Ukraine followed up that attack with more on November 13th. Another drone assault saw Ukraine destroy several more non-residential buildings in Kaluga and Bryansk, this time targeting important infrastructure in the regions, according to Voice of America. What does all of this tell us? Ukraine has identified Bryansk as a key strategic location, especially because of the arrival of North Korean weapons and soldiers. It's whittling away at the oblast's infrastructure, taking out ammo stores and other facilities to pave the way for a second incursion into Russian territory. Putin hopes to use his North Korean soldiers to retake Kursk. Ukraine may intend to respond by overrunning territory in Bryansk to force the Russian leader to spread his North Korean soldiers thinner than he intended. Speaking of the North Korean soldiers, the drone strikes in Bryansk will have severe consequences for their operational efficiency in the Kursk counteroffensive. Russia has relied on North Korea to extend its constantly depleting munition stockpiles for much of Putin's special military operation. In February 2024, South Korean Defense Minister Shin Won-sik claimed that North Korea had shipped at least 6,700 containers to Russia since September 2023. Those containers held either 3,152mm artillery rounds or 122mm rounds, according to Shin. It could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent, the defense minister claimed. More news about North Korean weapons arriving in Russia came in September 2024. Germany's Chief of Defense, General Carsten Breuer, claimed that North Korea's agreement with Russia was about increasing the production of weapons for Russia's aggression in Ukraine. By that point, the number of shipped containers had increased to 16,500, with Russia having used at least 65 of the missiles it received from North Korea against Ukraine by September 2024. A large portion of these North Korean shells and missiles likely found their way to the Bryansk ammo depots that Ukraine took out in October and November. Obviously, that's a massive hit to Russia because it's lost valuable ammunition, but think about what this means for the up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers that are currently engaged in the Kursk counteroffensive. Those weapons shipped by their country were familiar to those soldiers. They would have trained extensively in how to use them and would have been prepared to turn them against Ukraine's forces. Now a huge portion of the North Korean weapons are gone. That means North Korea's soldiers are going to have to rely on Russia to keep them well stocked, and that's something Putin has failed to do for his own soldiers throughout the war. Evidence of Russia's failure to provide its North Korean soldiers with weapons is already seeping in. On November 1st, Warthog Defense published a YouTube video showing a brief interview with one of the first North Korean soldiers wounded in the war. The soldier was part of a 40-man unit. He claims Russia simply pushed into an engagement with Ukraine in Kursk, ill-prepared and without the equipment they needed to fight. "The Russians did not provide us with anything," the wounded soldier claimed. "They threw us into an assault without prior intelligence, without ammunition, without normal weapons." Could the first of Ukraine's attacks on the Bryansk ammunition depots have contributed to this problem? Perhaps. And if it did, the second strike that came after the wounded soldier's interview will only make things worse for North Koreans in Russia. They're being forced to watch as Ukraine takes out storage facilities intended to keep them equipped as they support Russian troops in the Kursk counteroffensive. The more of these depots that go down, the less weaponry the North Korean soldiers will have to fight against Ukraine. Having 12,000 North Korean soldiers won't mean much for Putin if he can't equip them with the weapons they need. At best, the North Korean forces will have to try and quickly learn how to use Russian weapons before they get pushed into Kursk. At worst, they'll experience the same fate as the wounded soldier and his unit, becoming cannon fodder in Putin's ill-fated Kursk counteroffensive. That misuse of North Korea's forces could also come back to bite Putin when it comes to his relationship with Kim Jong-un. On the surface, that relationship seems like the best that the Russian leader has. North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense treaty in June, which North Korea ratified in November, which is why there are North Korean forces in Russia in the first place. But where did many of those North Korean soldiers end up? Bryansk. At least that's according to the Senior YouTube channel. In its report on the November 9th drone attack on a Bryansk ammo depot, the channel points out that many North Korean soldiers were in the oblast for training. They were supposed to be there, behind the front lines, to learn about Russian military strategy and became familiar with the Kremlin's goals. Instead, they had to watch their own ammunition stores get blown to pieces as Russia's antiquated air defenses failed to stop a rampant drone attack. What do you think that will do to North Korean morale? We may already have some answers to that question. If the wounded soldier mentioned earlier is correct, Russia intends to use its 12,000 North Korean soldiers as simply more bodies to send into Putin's meat grinder. With that and fewer weapons now at their disposal, some North Korean troops are already doing something that Putin would never have expected: running away. On October 15th, just 6 days after Ukraine's first Bryansk depot strike, the Kyiv Independent reported that at least 18 North Korean soldiers had already deserted their positions. Those 18 were spread across the Kursk and Bryansk oblasts. It's not outside the realms of possibility that the North Korean deserters stationed in Bryansk would have seen the first Bryansk strike and decided to get out of Dodge. As for those in Kursk, maybe they saw that Russia intended to send them into a fight they couldn't possibly win, just as it did to the 40-man unit of which the wounded soldier mentioned earlier was the only survivor. So they ran away as well. What will President Kim think as this news filters in? He's watching Putin misuse his soldiers, sending some into Kursk without the equipment they need, and he's being humiliated on the world stage by news that his troops are deserting. So far, all Kim's cooperative defense pact with Russia seems to be delivering is death to his own people. Will North Korea's leader care? Perhaps not about the people themselves, but he may see such massive losses of his soldiers and ammunition as evidence that Putin isn't strong enough to win against Ukraine. Therein lies perhaps the most important aspect of Ukraine's strikes in Bryansk. Even if they didn't target North Korean troops directly, they've sapped morale enormously. Russia's new soldiers no longer have access to the weapon stores they likely relied upon to give them at least some sense of familiarity while fighting on Russian soil. Some will be weaponless, many will be poorly trained, and the odds are that we'll even see more news of North Korean desertions as Putin's counteroffensive in Kursk proceeds. Ukraine has scored a massive moral victory with its 2 Bryansk strikes. It's now demoralized the North Korean soldiers to the point where they will simply not want to take part in Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. They'll be forced to do so, which means they'll be fighting solely to survive, rather than because they believe in Russia's cause. Ukraine has also shown that it's not going to back down in the face of enormous odds. Where Putin may have been relying on the 12,000 North Korean soldiers to provide the manpower he'd need to make Ukraine submit and leave Kursk, Ukraine has intelligently taken out several key pieces of infrastructure those soldiers will need. Ammo depots are gone, the North Korean forces are weakened. Only time will tell if all of this is enough to help Ukraine maintain the territory it's taken in Kursk, as well as if the damage it's done opens up the possibility of a secondary incursion into Bryansk. If nothing else, Ukraine has shown that Russia no longer trusts that it's capable of defeating Ukraine on its own. And demoralized North Korean troops who no longer have access to weapons and ammunition that their own country sent isn't going to change that. But what do you think about Ukraine's Bryansk drone strikes? Are they as damaging to the North Korean forces as they seem? How do you think Putin's approach to retaking Kursk will affect his relationship with Kim Jong-un? President Joe Biden has just made a decision that will change the entire course of the Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's much-vaunted victory plan required the United States to give the green light to a specific action that up until now the US hasn't allowed. America giving the go-ahead for this one thing would allow Ukraine to obliterate Russia by taking the fight directly to some of Russia's most important strategic assets. The US has spent the last 2.5 years hemming and hawing over this decision, but finally, it's happened. President Joe Biden has given Ukraine permission to strike Russia inside Russian territory using US-made and supplied long-range missiles. It's the last major act of a president who will soon leave the White House, and it's going to change the course of the war. And it's an act that's already benefited Ukraine. A mere day after the reports of permission being granted filed in, Ukraine took action. It launched the first of what will likely be many ATACMS missiles at Russia. This is massive news. In this video, we're going to examine the reasons behind Biden's decision to give the green light for ATACMS usage inside Russia before examining how Ukraine intends to use its missiles to obliterate the Russian Federation. The BBC was among the first to report on President Biden's decision. On November 18th, it delivered the basics. Biden had given the green light for ATACMS use inside Russia, the outlet said, in a major policy reversal. Previously, the use of these missiles had been restricted to targets inside Ukraine and in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, for fear that using them in Russia could escalate the war. CNN provides more details in its own report. It points out that the approval isn't official, in the sense that Biden's announced Ukraine's ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia to the public. Rather, the news of the approval comes from a pair of US officials who are close to the president and familiar with the wrangling that's been going on surrounding ATACMS usage. One of those officials points out that the missiles are currently intended for use in Kursk in the wake of Russia's decision to deploy 50,000 troops to the oblast. Those 50,000 troops may include as many as 12,000 North Korean soldiers, which Putin has at his disposal thanks in large part to the Cooperative Defense Pact he signed with North Korean President Kim Jong-un back in July 2024. Biden's advisors believe that the arrival of these troops could spark a new phase of the war, according to CNN. So the ATACMS approval delivers more firepower to the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk at a time when they're coming under intense pressure. Al Jazeera's diplomatic correspondent James Bays backs this reasoning up. He says that the aim of these Western nations is to support Ukraine, particularly in the area of Russia that Ukraine has occupied. Kursk. Why does Kursk matter? In August 2024, Volodymyr Zelensky made the unexpected decision to play Putin at his own game. Rather than focusing merely on the defense of the beleaguered Donetsk region inside Ukraine, he sent a small contingent of the country's troops into Russia's Kursk Oblast. A red line was crossed. Ukraine entered Russia, and in a matter of weeks, Ukraine was claiming that it held over 450 square miles of Russian territory, including 93 villages, thanks to its counter-invasion. The Kursk invasion marked a turning point in the war, with Ukraine's capture of Russian territory giving it a major bargaining chip should negotiations ever start with Putin. Ukraine now has the option of trading what it holds in Kursk for some of the territory Russia has taken during Putin's special military operation. Of course, that bargaining chip goes away if Ukraine isn't able to keep the territory it has in Kursk. Putin's deployment of 50,000 soldiers in a counteroffensive is supposed to retake the many settlements Ukraine has claimed. Ukraine needs to fight against that counteroffensive, which is where the ATACMS missiles come into play. With them, Ukraine can launch strikes against Russian and North Korean positions in Kursk from within its own borders. That's huge for Ukraine. It's now able to support its soldiers on the ground with missile strikes that Russia can't easily counter. Back to CNN's report. It also notes that the approval of ATACMS use in Russia has been a long time coming. The US outright refused to send the missiles to Ukraine, even for use within its own territory, for the first 2 years of the war. Escalation of the war was the main fear at the time. The US was wary of what Putin might do in response to sending such powerful missiles to Ukraine. CNN also notes that some within the United States also worried about the US eating into stockpiles of ATACMS, essentially reducing its ability to defend itself in return for arming Ukraine. President Biden reversed that policy in February 2024, enabling the first ATACMS systems to enter Ukraine in April. But even then, the edict was clear. Ukraine was only to use the missiles to attack Russian positions within its own territory. Crimea could be included in that list, given that the US doesn't recognize Russia's 2014 annexation of the peninsula, meaning it should still be owned by Ukraine, but attacks on Russia itself were a no-go. President Zelensky had pressed long and often to get the go-ahead to use the missiles against Russia, even before the US allowed them to be used inside Ukraine. There were signs that the approval was on its way several months before it came. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported on what it called a faint glimmer of hope for Ukraine after months of Zelensky's haranguing for permission to use ATACMS missiles against Russia. Biden responded, "We're working that out right now." When asked about lifting his geographic restrictions, the president's Secretary of State Antony Blinken also noted that the US has continuously adjusted and adapted based on battlefield conditions. The signs were there that approval was incoming. Putin's decision to use North Korean troops in his counteroffensive against the Ukrainian positions in Kursk appears to have pushed President Biden to make his decision. After all, Putin's use of North Korean soldiers represents the type of escalation the US always feared. Now it needs to help Ukraine counter that escalation with stronger weapons. Zelensky finally has what he's wanted for over 2 years. and Russia isn't happy. Putin has already made several threats against the US as it deliberated over whether to permit Ukraine to use ATACMS inside Russia. Toward the end of September 2024, less than 2 weeks after President Biden and Blinken's comments about considering ATACMS usage, Putin was on the warpath. It's proposed that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state, be considered as their joint attack on the Russian Federation, Putin raged during a September meeting of Russia's Security Council. The use of the word nuclear was very intentional. Putin was essentially saying that Russia would consider the US permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russia as an attack conducted by a nuclear nation. And even though those missiles won't carry nuclear warheads, Russia reserved the right to respond to such conventional missile strikes with nuclear weapons. In short, don't do it, America. We'll use nukes if you let Ukraine use your missiles against us. The Russian response has been no less muted now that President Biden has given his approval. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, was one of the first to respond. If such a decision was really formulated and brought to the attention of the Kyiv regime, this is a qualitatively new round of tension and a qualitatively new situation in terms of the involvement of the United States in the conflict, he said when speaking to Russian media. Of course, Peskov's statements ignore the fact that Russia had already escalated with its decision to use North Korean troops against Ukraine in Kursk. But that hypocrisy has never stopped the Kremlin from making threats against the US before. Russian lawmaker Maria Butina also warned that President Biden's actions would lead to a massive escalation. However, she also pointed to Russia's hope that President-elect Donald Trump would overturn Biden's decision. I have a great hope that Trump will overcome this decision if this has been made, because they are seriously risking the start of World War III, claimed Butina. Peskov has also made mention of the outgoing administration in Washington and its intention to add fuel to the fire in the war. So it appears Russia may be hoping that Donald Trump will come to their rescue and save the country from ATACMS missiles. Whether that will actually happen, President-elect Trump's proposed peace plan could prevent escalation, remains to be seen. It's also worth noting that President Biden's decision hasn't been met with universal approval from other nations in Europe. Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia have all condemned the decision, perhaps because they believe that using ATACMS missiles in Russia will escalate tensions to the point where other European countries are threatened. Politico also reports that one French military official says that permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles will not change the balance of power in the war. It will merely slow down rather than stop what the official views as an industrial war, in which the nation that can produce the most weapons in the long run is the most likely to win. It's difficult to determine whether those comments amount to French disapproval of President Biden's decision or not. Still, it doesn't matter, the decision has been made. And perhaps it's President Zelensky who provides the most telling response to Biden's decision. Reacting to the news, he said, "Today there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves." The last statement is telling. Zelensky's suggesting that all of the talk is meaningless because Ukraine has the permission it needs. And with that, we come to a key question. Why is Russia so afraid of America's ATACMS missiles? We only need to look at the missile specs to find the answer. Al Jazeera provides some details about the ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System, in its report about Biden's decision. It says they were first developed in the 1980s, with the missiles having a 190-mile range that allows them to be launched from within Ukraine to strike Russian territory. They're built by Lockheed Martin and are launchable by both the HIMARS systems the US has sent to Ukraine in July 2022 and the M270 multiple launch rocket systems Ukraine received from the UK in the same year. In other words, Ukraine already has everything it needs to fire the ATACMS. It just needed permission to use them how it wanted. Missile Threat provides more details, noting that the ATACMS is a single-stage missile that can be loaded with a high explosive or blast fragmentation warhead, the latter of which packs up to 950 submunitions, allowing for powerful scattershot attacks against Russian positions. The mention of HIMARS and the M270 system should also clue you into the fact that the ATACMS is a road mobile missile that allows Ukraine to launch from almost anywhere within its territory. That's what will make it so useful for countering Russia's Kursk offensive. Ukraine can literally drive its ATACMS missiles to the border it shares with Russia and launch both into the territory it's taken and the positions that Russian and North Korean troops have established on Kursk's outskirts. The ATACMS is also designed for precision. 4 tail fins located on its rear keep it stable while it's in flight, with the nose cone at the front doing the same. The missile also combines GPS and an inertial navigation system, or INS, that allows it to fly directly to its intended target while minimizing collateral damage. The INS system also offers protection against interference and electronic jamming, meaning Russia will need to rely on its S-300 and S-400 anti-air systems to shoot it out of the skies. Given that the ATACMS can reach speeds of up to Mach 3, hitting it while it's in flight is a pretty tall order. In short, it's an extremely powerful missile, the likes of which Russia hasn't needed to contend with for much of the war. Outside of a handful of strikes in Crimea, with one taking place in June 2024 that killed at least 4 Russians and injured a further 151, Ukraine hasn't been able to get the most out of its ATACMS missiles. Now it can. And it's that fact that terrifies Putin. So we come to another question. What does Ukraine's new ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia mean for the future of the war? It's all bad news for Russia. And Ukraine has already given us one of the answers. On November 19th, the BBC reported that US officials had confirmed that Ukraine has launched the first of its ATACMS missiles at Russia. The strike involved 5 missiles, all targeting the Bryansk region, according to Russia's defense ministry. Of those 5, 1 managed to make it through Russia's anti-air defenses, with fragments of the exploded missile causing a fire at a military facility in the border oblast. At least that's according to Russia. The US officials who confirmed the attack say that the numbers are much different. Ukraine actually fired 8 missiles, only 2 of which Russia managed to intercept. This suggests that 6 got through, likely causing far more damage than Russia would like to admit. Reuters followed up the BBC's report, noting that Ukraine is now claiming that it managed to strike a Russian arms depot located 70 miles deep into the Bryansk region. The attack was also accompanied by a drone strike, targeting at least 8 southern and central regions. Russia's defense ministry claims it shot down 42 of the drones, along with 4 of 5 ATACMS missiles. Whatever the truth may be, the Kremlin was quick to respond to the news. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov immediately accused the United States of escalating a conflict of which it shouldn't have any part. That ATACMS was used repeatedly overnight against the Bryansk region is of course a signal that they, meaning the United States, want escalation, Lavrov claimed. He then made the chilling claim that Russia would proceed with any future decisions from the understanding that Ukraine's ATACMS were operated by American military experts. And this attack may just be the start of Ukraine's ATACMS offensive. As mentioned earlier, Putin has amassed around 50,000 soldiers, including troops from North Korea, to drive out the Ukrainian occupiers in the Kursk Oblast. That counteroffensive is going poorly for Russia. On November 12th, Forbes military expert David Axe reported that Ukraine had already destroyed 77 Russian armored vehicles during the first 6 days of the counteroffensive. Most of those were along the northern edge of the territory Ukraine holds in the oblast. And to make matters worse for Putin, those reports came amidst others claiming that Ukraine had killed 1,950 Russian soldiers and destroyed over 100 armored vehicles in a single day across the entire 800-mile front line. The new voice of Ukraine says that Russia has resorted to flattening their own troops and killing their own citizens by essentially carpet-bombing the areas in Kursk that Ukraine holds. Russia has shelled the territory 11,578 times, the media outlet claims, in addition to dropping 3,243 guided aerial bombs and 356 unguided missiles onto Kursk. That's where Ukraine's ATACMS weapons come into play again. Russia can blanket Kursk with bombs from fortifications it's built outside the new front line Ukraine created when it invaded Kursk. Previously, there was little Ukraine could do about this, beyond holding its ground against the constant bombing. But with permission to use ATACMS inside Russia, comes the ability to target the airfields and launching locations Russia has used to attack Kursk so intently. With some of those locations destroyed, the Ukrainian troops on the ground can focus on defending themselves against the 50,000-strong counteroffensive, significantly raising their chances of holding Kursk for the long run. And it's not just bases near Kursk that Ukraine can attack. It has so many more potential targets to strike with ATACMS that would relieve pressure across the entire front line. In the wake of Biden's approval, the Kyiv Post noted that having access to ATACMS could allow Ukraine to strike over 245 military objects. These objects include 15 air bases, with some of the most prominent being in the Bryansk, Kursk, Lipetsk, Rostov, and Kaluga regions. It's a massive upgrade on the rockets Ukraine previously launched from their HIMARS, which could only travel 50 miles and hit 20 of the 245-plus potential targets ATACMS can reach. And Ukraine has already proven it can hit Bryansk with its November 19th strike. Back to the airfields. They matter because they're what Russia uses to launch its terrifying glide bombs, predominantly made using Russia's Soviet-era Fab 1500 bombs, which weigh about 1.65 tons. Glide bombs are made using a special upgrade kit that costs as little as $20,000. That kit essentially equips Russia's old bombs with wings, allowing its aircraft to launch them from behind the front lines so they can glide to targets in Ukraine. Russia has buffeted Ukraine with these bombs, March 2024 alone saw Russia send around 3,000 glide bombs Ukraine's way, and many more thousands have hit Ukraine since. As for why they're so dangerous, you only need to compare a glide bomb to a standard artillery shell. A Russian 152mm shell contains around 14 pounds of explosive. The country's 1.65-ton glide bomb packs an enormous 440 pounds of explosive into their massive shells, giving each bomb over 31 times the destructive power of an artillery shell. The one downside to glide bombs, from the Russian perspective, is that they need to be launched from the air. A plane has to take off, hit a suitable altitude, and position itself appropriately before launch. For that, Russia needs airfields from which these planes can take off, which brings us right back to the 15 airfields Ukraine can now target with its ATACMS. Taking just one of those airfields out drastically reduces Russia's ability to safely launch glide bombs from behind the front lines. Taking out several would massively relieve the intense pressure Russia has placed on Ukraine in its push to take Donetsk. Again, we'll see a similar result to what the ATACMS will achieve in Kursk. Less fire from above, allowing Ukrainian ground troops to counter Russia's offensive maneuvers on the ground. Beyond the airfields, you also have to consider what other Russian assets fall within the 245-plus objects the Kyiv post identifies. For instance, many of those assets are likely storage units Russia uses to keep its troops supplied on the front lines in Ukraine. Taking these storage facilities out would mean Russia is less able to equip its troops on the ground. ATACMS strikes may also allow Ukraine to destroy Russian tanks and artillery units before they're deployed to the front, again relieving pressure on its soldiers in Donetsk. So the ATACMS isn't just a glide bomb destroyer. It's a missile that allows Ukraine to disrupt Russian supply lines that it couldn't previously reach. Timothy Ash, who's a Chatham House Associate Fellow, says as much when he tells Al Jazeera, Ukraine needs to be able to hit Russian supply chains, which it's moved back beyond current Ukrainian missile range. That's another good point. The Ukraine war's front lines now extend so deep into the Donbas region that Ukraine's short-range HIMARS rockets aren't even able to hit Russian positions inside its own territory. The 50-mile range doesn't allow it. With ATACMS, Ukraine can start by taking out Russia's logistical assets near the outskirts of its own country before moving on to tackle the many Russian objects the Kyiv post mentions. Ash goes on to point out that simply having the ability to use ATACMS on Russian territory gives Ukraine something very important: leverage. That's what Ukraine wanted to create when it invaded Kursk, and it gets even more now it's able to use ATACMS. As Ash points out, Biden may have made his decision intending to deliver more leverage to Zelensky in future negotiations with Putin. Once the capability has been given, it's harder to take away, he notes. Putin will want to negotiate limits on Ukraine's military capabilities. If Zelensky and Putin ever do find themselves at the negotiating table, perhaps Ukraine's president can use his ATACMS to force Putin into reducing his use of glide bombs or pulling back from various regions in Donetsk. Therein may lie the main reason behind Biden granting approval to use ATACMS so late into his presidency. Ash says, it looks like Russia will escalate over the next couple of months before the Trump presidency and likely negotiations. It's already doing precisely that if his actions in Kursk are anything to go by. Introducing soldiers from another country in his special military operation is an escalation beyond anything we've seen Putin do since February 2022. So Ukraine needs to be able to hit longer range to dent Russia's offensive capabilities, Ash concludes. Notably, Trump has already called on Russia not to escalate the conflict any further. Putin ignored those calls, but that's unlikely to dissuade Trump from pushing for peace when he takes office in January 2025. Ukraine may welcome any negotiations Trump can mediate, but it'll want to enter those negotiations from a position of power, which means using ATACMS not just as leverage, but as a tool to weaken Russia in the 2 months before Trump takes office. Speaking of escalation, that's precisely what occurred in the wake of reports of Biden's decision. Before Ukraine's November 19 attack, Russia marked the 1,000th day of the war by changing up its nuclear doctrine. Now it says that any attack conducted by a non-nuclear state, such as Ukraine, if backed by a nuclear power, such as the US, will constitute a joint attack on Russia. And with that change, Putin has opened the door for Russia to use nukes in response to Ukraine's ATACMS usage. Will he go that far? Only time will tell. As for Zelensky, Biden's policy reversal is massive news for his country's brave military. It also takes him one step closer to enacting the victory plan he presented to the US back in October. If nothing else, Biden's move takes Ukraine one step closer to resolving things with Russia, be that on the battlefield or diplomatically. The latter seems to be Zelensky's preferred option as he awaits Donald Trump's arrival in office. The Hindu reported on an interview he gave to Ukrainian radio just days before Biden's policy reversal. "For our part, we must do everything we can to ensure that this war ends next year," Zelensky said. "We have to end it by diplomatic means." ATACMS trained on key Russian locations may give Ukraine the leverage it needs to do just that. But as Ukraine's November 19th strike demonstrates, Zelensky is far from shy about using his missiles to hit Russia where it hurts right now. So what do you think about Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use the ATACMS on Russian targets? Will it allow Ukraine to negotiate a better deal for itself when Donald Trump becomes president and enact his peace plan? Or will Putin escalate from here, making the US regret its decision in the process? When war forces innovation, something extraordinary happens, and Ukraine's FrankenSAM is proof of that. This hybrid air defense system is so effective on the battlefield that even the US, with its vast military arsenal, now wants it. What began as Ukraine's ingenious response to overwhelming Russian airstrikes has turned into a powerful weapon that's caught the eye of the world's most advanced military. But what makes FrankenSAM so revolutionary, and why has it become such a coveted asset for the US? As we dive into its origins, its impact on Ukraine's defenses, and how it's reshaping modern warfare, one thing becomes clear. When necessity meets innovation, even the strongest militaries take notice. Let's dive in. FrankenSAM, as you've probably guessed, is a mashup of the words Frankenstein and SAM, or surface-to-air missile. On July 8, 2024, the Senate Armed Services Committee, or SASC, filed its 2025 Defense Policy Bill with the US Senate. It called for the US Secretary of Defense to provide a briefing to the Congressional Defense Committees looking into the US Air Force's use of the FrankenSAM, or at least the overarching concept behind it, no later than March 31, 2025. The SASC document presented before the Senate shed some light on what previously were murky details about how and why the FrankenSAM systems came to be developed in the first place. They were conceived in late 2022, early 23, as a solution to Ukraine's urgent requirement for more robust ground-based air defense capabilities to deal with the constant aerial bombardment by Russian crewed aircraft, drones, and cruise missiles. These attacks had intensified and spread to energy and other critical infrastructure in response to Ukraine's bombing of the Kerch Bridge that links the Crimean Peninsula to the Russian mainland on October 8, 2022, making the need for improved air defense systems even more critical. But there were two big problems in helping the Ukrainians. Although the US and fellow NATO allies like the UK and Germany had stockpiles of the air defense missiles that Ukraine needed ready to go, the Ukrainians couldn't use them. That's because the SAMs used by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, or UAF, such as the Buk M1 and S-300P, were all Russian-made from the Soviet era. The launchers for those systems simply weren't able to handle modern Western missiles. The Ukrainians needed launchers along with the missiles, but US-made SAM air defense launchers weren't anywhere near as abundant as the missiles they fire. For example, the US only has around 60 Patriot systems in total itself. The full systems are not quick or cheap to make, costing about $1 billion each. So there are only so many that can be sent to Ukraine, and that number is not enough to cover what they need. That left Ukrainian officials asking their allies for help in finding appropriate missiles for the 60 Soviet Buk missile launchers lying idle in the arsenal because they were running low. But realizing that it would be difficult for the West to obtain Russian-made ammunition, they came up with the idea of converting the launchers to use NATO-caliber anti-aircraft missiles instead and offered to start building them. Around 8 months later, in October 2023, the first FrankenSAM successfully arrived in Ukraine, a unique hybrid air defense system combining Western missiles and other components with Soviet-era missile launchers. Today, according to Alexander Kamshin, the head of the Ukrainian Ministry of Strategic Industries, there are about 5 such projects already deployed to the battlefield. But so far, only 3 hybrid weapons that are the fruits of the joint Ukrainian-US program developing FrankenSAMs domestically in Ukraine have been seen in action. Kamshin may have been referring to the British Supercat ASRAM hybrid system that's been specially adapted for Ukraine and spotted in the wild, or the exciting new Frankentank concept, recently announced by Rheinmetall from Germany. We'll come back to those later, but first, what are the 3 Ukrainian US-made FrankenSAMs that the US Air Force is so adamant about implementing? Interestingly, the SASC's Senate document refers to systems on trucks or stationary pallets. This is an intriguing detail, as there have been no reports of Ukraine using such FrankenSAM configurations. The only known truck-mounted air defense system provided to Ukraine is the British Supercat ASRAM system, which features an AIM-132 ASRAM missile launcher mounted on a 6x6 Supercat all-terrain truck chassis with a twin-rail launcher for a pair of missiles mounted at the rear. The 3 FrankenSAM systems currently in use are 1. Soviet Buk SAM systems adapted to fire RIM-7 missiles, 2. A Soviet radar system modified to guide AIM-9M missiles, and 3. A hybrid system combining launchers and missiles from the Patriot air defense system with Soviet-made S-300 radars. While there are no publicly available figures as to how many of each of these systems are active on the battlefield, it seems a safe bet that the first of the three systems, the modified Buk, is the most widely deployed. Back in October 2023, Ukrainian MP Oleksandra Ustinova told journalists that it had taken a month for US specialists to modify 5 Buks, with 17 more pending. If they've kept up that rate of production, it's possible all 60 of Ukraine's Buk stockpile could have been converted into FrankenSAMs by now. This system is, in essence, a Buk M1 or 9A310 launcher modified to use RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missiles, instead of the standard 9M38 missiles for which it was designed. Although no match for modern Western equivalents, the Buk, also known as the SA-11 Gadfly, is still a sturdy piece of gear that was a stalwart of the Soviet army in the years before the USSR's collapse in 1991. It's 30.5 feet long, weighs 32.4 tons, and has a speed of 40 miles per hour. It carries a crew of 4, and in its original configuration also carried 4 9M38M1 missiles. Ukraine's stockpile of these missiles has understandably been depleted to a large extent, which is why their Buks needed to be converted to handle Western missiles like the Sea Sparrow instead. The RIM-7 Sea Sparrow is a SAM developed by Raytheon and General Dynamics for the United States Navy. It's a ship-launched variant of the AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missile, designed for point defense against anti-ship missiles, aircraft, and low-flying cruise missiles. It was first developed in 1976 and goes for around $165,000 each today. It features radar-guided, semi-automatic homing, a rather destructive annular blast fragmentation warhead, and a dual-thrust rocket motor for improved range and maneuverability. With ongoing upgrades and improvements to better deal with UAVs and sea-skimming targets, it's a missile that's stood the test of time. And the US has warehouses full of them. Because it's essentially a sea missile adapted into a SAM, there are a few trade-offs in using the RIM-7 instead of the 9M38M1 on a Buk. The engagement range will be 12.5 miles with an altitude ceiling of 9.3 miles, as opposed to around 18.5 miles for the Buk-launched 9M38M1. But the RIM-7 is 3 times lighter, 507 pounds versus 1,521 pounds, 6.5 feet shorter and half as wide. This means you can load more missiles on a single launcher, and they're likely to be more accurate, albeit at the cost of roughly a third of the range. The modification of the Buk to handle RIM-7s was simplified somewhat by the fact that both the RIM-7 and the 9M38 use semi-active laser guidance. So the main challenge was really to make the missiles see the target designation provided by the Buk's 9S35 radar as if it was a Mark 115, Mark 95, or Mark 23 radar. It's not clear whether the standard radar was modified or replaced entirely with a US system in this FrankenSAM. But either way, clearly it works. The second type of FrankenSAM, a Soviet radar system modified to guide AIM-9M Sidewinder missiles, might be even easier to adapt, according to some experts. That's because the AIM-9M doesn't need target illumination, instead relying on its own homing head. All the system operator has to do is show the target, program the homing head, let the missile lock on, and press launch. What's more, either a modern optical aiming station or even an ordinary sight is sufficient for launching an AIM-9M. The AIM-9M also offers flexibility in the type of chassis on which the launchers can be mounted, because the dimensions of the missiles are quite moderate. It weighs about 187 pounds, is under 10 feet long, 5 inches in diameter, and has a wingspan of 11 inches. The AIM-9M, AIM being short for Air Intercept Missile, is a supersonic, short-range, air-to-air variant of the AIM-9 Sidewinder family, developed by Raytheon since the 1980s. It features improved IRCCM, which stands for Infrared Countermeasures, and a digital ignition safety device. It also has high off-bore sight capabilities, allowing the missile to track targets at high seeker gimbal angles or highly distant from its bore sight. Although it's essentially an air-to-air missile rather than a SAM, it's been used in a SAM system before, namely in the MIM-72 Chaparral. This obsolete US-developed SAM was able to use fine-tuned AIM-9D missiles to destroy targets within a 3-mile range, at an altitude up to 2.5 miles. There's unfortunately not much information available on how the AIM-9M integrates with Soviet radar systems. However, in addition to its adaptability, another compelling reason to use the AIM-9M is that since it's largely been replaced by the more advanced AIM-9X by the US Armed Forces, there are significant quantities spread around warehouses throughout the US and its allied nations that can be quickly and easily made available to Ukraine. That brings us to the third variety of FrankenSAM, which is also the most powerful and secretive, the FrankenSAM with Patriot missiles. Patriot stands for Phased Array Tracking Radar for Intercept on Target. Because there are very few details publicly available about this system, we can only speculate as to which radar system and chassis have been merged with Patriot components. There are three likely candidates: the Buk M1, the Soviet-made S-300, and a modern, fully digital Ukrainian system like the ATK-6 KS-1 Phoenix. All Patriot missiles, both the GEM-T, which is deployed against aerodynamic targets, and the CRI-MSC anti-missile interceptors, require radio command guidance in the initial stage of the engagement, which is provided by the AN/MPQ-53, AN/MPQ-65, or the newer LTAMDS radar. It's these radar components of the Patriot system that are the rarest, most expensive, take the longest to make, and are therefore most problematic to ship to Ukraine. While it's unknown which Soviet or Ukrainian radar has been modified to be able to launch Patriot missiles, one thing is for sure: transfer of only the launchers, loaders, and a few support vehicles without the core AN/MPQ-53 or AN/MPQ-65 radars is bound to be easier, faster, and much more cost-effective. This holds true whether the FrankenSAM Patriot is used in Ukraine or to defend airfields and infrastructure on the US mainland, as envisioned by the SASC. Raytheon's MIM-104 Patriot missile is of course a much more powerful projectile than either the RIM-7 Sea Sparrow or AIM-9M Sidewinder used in the other FrankenSAM varieties. For one, it's an actual SAM system designed to detect, track, and engage a wide range of aerial targets, including aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. Each system consists of a mobile launching station, a radar unit, and a control center, with each launching station carrying up to 4 missiles. The system can be easily transported and redeployed and uses advanced phased array radar, which provides 360-degree coverage and can detect targets at long ranges. Patriot missiles have a range of 43.5 miles, an altitude of 79,000 to 98,000 feet, a speed of up to Mach 3.5, and cost a cool $1 to $6 million per missile, depending on the variant and configuration. Although they're the most powerful of the SAM missiles incorporated into FrankenSAMs that we know about, they're also not the kind of missiles you want to be indiscriminately firing to shoot down Gerund 2 drones, otherwise known as flying lawnmowers, which cost 50 times less at minimum. Unfortunately, other than a few official and unofficial videos and pictures of them, that's just about all that's actually known for sure about the FrankenSAM project. Publicly known for sure, that is. Although no details are provided in their document presented to the Senate, the SASC must have assessed the Ukrainians' experience of using the FrankenSAM in combat favorably to come to the conclusion that the US Air Force should look seriously at adapting it for its own use, specifically for air-based defense. But why would the US Air Force, or indeed the Department of Defense as a whole, need hybrid SAM systems to defend its air bases, especially back home, ingenious as the FrankenSAM may be? Aren't they protected by the world's biggest arsenal of the world's most sophisticated weapon systems already? Well, yes and no. Things change, and sometimes they change fast. The committee recognizes that the standard budget and acquisition process of the Department of Defense, or DoD for short, does not allow for agile development and rapid procurement of innovative technological solutions designed to solve real-world strategies, the SASC contends. However, today's continually evolving threats require the DoD to adapt and allow for creative and agile responses to emergent problems. If you think about how rapidly warfare has evolved in just the last couple of years with UAVs, electronic warfare, maritime drones, hypersonic missiles, and surveillance becoming decisive factors on the battlefield, you can see where they're coming from. And that's where FrankenSAM comes in, they say. The core of FrankenSAM leverages easy-to-use, proven technologies that limit the dependence on component development timelines, while emphasizing integration of existing and new equipment into an open architecture system. The modular approach of the system can be quickly integrated into existing air defense systems where gaps may occur in protecting installations, or providing quick reaction, standalone point defense where a larger comprehensive air defense system may not exist. FrankenSAM could allow the DoD to kill two birds with one stone. Firstly, the US has stockpiles of perfectly good and deadly missiles and related equipment that are more or less lying redundant because they've been replaced by upgraded models. These are, in many cases, the models currently being produced for both use by the US and its allies, who have also upgraded their systems. By repurposing this stock of older missiles, launchers, and other components for use in hybrid systems like the FrankenSAM, a large, readily available arsenal that's already bought and paid for is created. That seems like a very effective way to address one of the few known weaknesses in US defense, which is in the area of short-range air defense, or SHORAD. This weakness in air defense has arisen precisely because warfare has evolved so fast, especially in the air. The US military's footprint both at home and around the world is so huge that it hasn't quite had time to catch up everywhere yet. There are holes. FrankenSAM offers an easy fix, both to plug the short-term holes and to provide an agile, rapidly deployable, mobile air defense solution for use almost anywhere. So where are the holes and how can FrankenSAM plug them? Thomas Newdick sums it up well in his comprehensive article for the Warzone. It's no secret that the US military in general has a SHORADS deficit. Limited numbers of ground-based air defenses also extend to the supplies of longer-range systems like the Patriot, and there's no mid-tier system fielded by the US military in significant numbers. The realities of future conflicts likely being fought in non-permissive aerial environments have forced a shift in thinking, and with SHORADS being needed sooner rather than later, a semi-off-the-shelf solution like a FrankenSAM system is obviously of interest. Air bases are particularly vulnerable, he says, especially those far from home, and in increasingly contested environments. The threats from any combination of low-flying fighter aircraft, helicopters, cruise missiles, and drones that might be employed by China, for example, against an airfield used by the US Air Force in the Pacific will be complex and varied. The ability to protect against cruise missiles and drones that might have penetrated the outer layers of the air defenses and directly threaten the airbase and the critical assets that it hosts could well make the difference between victory and defeat. Very small units that are far forward deployed in less conspicuous areas and those farther back will also need some form of protection against lower volume aerial threats. Sure, at an airbase you might expect there to be crewed fighters to tackle incoming drone and missile threats, but in the event of a large conflict, they're likely to be needed everywhere, making it all the more important that airfields are defended by dedicated SHORADS. At the same time, inside the US itself, air bases and much other critical infrastructure have been shown to be potentially vulnerable, particularly to drone attacks. The country is so big and drone technology is so pervasive that it's hard to keep up with the vulnerabilities, let alone patch them. For these reasons, it's not hard to see why the configurable and highly mobile FrankenSAM is of such interest to the US military. They should be fairly easy to transport by air, so can simply be assembled and flown into the bases where they're needed, even on very short notice. Once in theater, they'd be able to move quickly to new locations, making them unpredictable and harder to target, an important factor when faced with long-range drone and cruise missile attacks. They could even be installed as platforms in semi-permanent locations or at sea aboard support vessels and sea bases. Meanwhile, perhaps inspired by the FrankenSAM, Ukraine will soon be receiving a different flavor of reconstituted SHORAD in the form of Rheinmetall's Frankenstein air defense tank. That's the German innovation hinted at earlier in the video. The Frankenstein air defense tank consists of an advanced German Skyranger anti-aircraft gun mounted on a Leopard 1 battle tank. The Skyranger 30 is a mobile system capable of engaging fixed and rotary wing aircraft, Group 1 and 2 unmanned aerial systems, loitering munitions, and cruise missiles. With a weight of around 2 to 2.5 tons, it can be installed on lighter 6x6 wheeled vehicles and operated both autonomously and in networked operations. It's fitted with a modified version of the Oerlikon KCA 1.28-inch gun. It has an effective range of 1.86 miles, a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, and the ability to elevate 85 degrees to combat terminal diving targets. The total payload of 7 ounces is time-programmed upon leaving the muzzle to open up in front of a target to form a lethal cone. To detect targets, the Skyranger 30 uses the S-band AESA multi-mission radar (AMMR) developed by Rheinmetall Italia, with 5 flat antennas integrated around the turret, providing full 360-degree coverage. For passive detection, it's installed with Rheinmetall's FIRST fast infrared search and track, which is optimized to detect pop-up targets such as helicopters. Identification and tracking are handled by a compact target tracker that includes an HD-cooled MWIR thermal camera, 1 Full HD TV camera, and 2 laser rangefinders, one devoted to air targets and the other to land targets. Additional features include 2 ROSI, or Rapid Obscuring System launchers, each with 9 multispectral smoke grenades, a hatch in the hull ceiling to view the battlefield from outside, and a coaxial machine gun fitted on the left of the main gun for use as a self-defense weapon. It's an impressive-sounding system, and one likely to be welcomed by Ukraine with open arms, and the sooner they receive them, the better. It's also probable that the German DoD, like its American counterparts, is also eyeing the holes in its own SHORAD systems and evaluating how the Frankenstein air defense tank and other ways of creatively reconstituting its arsenal might be put to use plugging those holes. But with the US and its allies like Germany increasingly drawn into conflicts around the world, from Ukraine to Israel and the Red Sea to the South China Sea, Newdick says, time may be fast running out to procure and field such systems. As for the FrankenSAMs, wouldn't it be fitting if a system developed under a crash program to provide a rapid and inexpensive solution for Ukraine ends up becoming a long-term critical part of US air defense and beyond? August 26, 2024, Russia, still reeling from Ukraine's successful invasion of Kursk, is looking for a way to hit back. The response comes on this date, with Russia launching a large-scale missile and drone attack across Ukraine involving both cruise and ballistic missiles. It's among the largest missile strikes on Ukrainian territory since the war began. A massive volley of at least 127 missiles and 109 drones peppered the Ukrainian skies in an attack that lasted more than 8 hours. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was quick to condemn the strike, saying, "And like most Russian strikes, this one is just as dastardly, targeting civilian infrastructure," before adding a key point: Russian President Vladimir Putin can only do what the world allows him to do. That final point is a reference to Zelensky's constant calls for permission to use the long-range missiles its Western allies have provided to strike Russia on its own territory. That permission, specifically from the United States, has not come yet, with Ukraine limited to using American weapons to strike Russian territory near the Kharkiv region. It can't use missiles to strike deeper into Russia, yet. That may all be on the verge of changing as Ukraine starts a slow move away from relying on externally provided weapons. It's building a weapon of its own, completely homemade, and more than capable of striking Russia at its heart, while giving Zelensky and his troops a key advantage that could ultimately spell game over for Putin's special military operation. What is that homemade weapon? That's the question we will answer in this video as we examine the 2 missiles Ukraine is currently producing, what's made that production possible, and what having these new weapons will mean for Ukraine. But before all of that, we need to look at the background behind why these weapons matter, specifically in terms of how missiles have offered Russia such a massive advantage over Ukraine. The barrage on August 26th is far from the first time Russia has used missiles to strike Ukrainian cities. In fact, the tactic has been a feature of Putin's strategy. On February 22, 2024, the second anniversary of the beginning of Putin's special military operation, Ukrainian spokesperson Yuri Inhut pointed out that Russia had launched over 8,000 missiles during 2 years of war. That amounts to around 77 missiles per week, with many of those missile strikes being accompanied by drones. A staggering 4,630 of them, in fact, with Inhut claiming that Ukraine has managed to destroy 3,605 of those drones during the first 2 years of the war. Still, it's clear that a key Putin tactic is to constantly bombard Ukrainian cities and infrastructure with missiles, heavily burdening the country's anti-air defenses in the process. Russia claims that it only targets military facilities and energy infrastructure with these attacks. The August 26th strike demonstrates otherwise. Russian missiles have been just as destructive in major Ukrainian population hubs as they've been for the country's military locations. And it gets worse for Ukraine. While it finds itself unable to respond to these missile strikes with missiles of its own, Russia is looking further afield to keep the barrages going. On the same day that Inhut released the figures of the sheer volume of missiles his country has to face from Russia, the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, revealed that some of these missiles aren't of Russian origin. According to the SBU, several missile attacks launched by Russia in December 2023 involved the use of Hwasong-11 missiles from North Korea, with those missiles having injured at least 100 people while killing around 24 more. The SBU presented evidence to back up its statements, producing Hwasong-11 missile debris it claims it had found on the battlefield. The SBU says that these missiles have been used as part of the shelling of the Zaporizhia region in December 2023, with strikes against Kyiv and Kharkiv in early 2024, also featuring North Korean missiles. Add to all of this, February 2024, also marking the first time that Russia used its Zircon hypersonic missile in Ukraine, and you can see the vital role missile strikes have played in Putin's strategy. All the while, Ukraine has been unable to respond. It had to rely on anti-air defenses, including a pair of Patriot missile defense systems, to try to protect its people as best it could. But outside of using missiles to attack Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014 and is still considered to be Ukrainian sovereign territory by much of the international community, Ukraine hasn't been able to fight fire with fire. Ukraine's allies have already provided some long-range weapons at this point. However, Ukraine hasn't been allowed to use them offensively. And that's been a sore point for Zelensky throughout the war. The Ukrainian president's call to be able to use the missiles its allies are providing to hit Russia in its own territory has been constant and, up until now, largely unanswered. The most recent of these calls came during a September 2024 meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, or UDCG, Held at Germany's Ramstein air base, the UDCG meeting saw Zelensky say that Ukraine needs to have this long-range capability, not only on the divided territory of Ukraine, but also on the Russian territory, so that Russia is motivated to seek peace. As has so often been the case, Zelensky received mild pushback from his allies. Al Jazeera reports that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin subtly claimed that these long-range capabilities weren't needed, as he confirmed that the US would be providing an additional $250 million in military aid. He said that Russia had moved its glide bombs so far back from the front lines that they will be out of the range of American-made ATACMS missiles. What's more, Austin said Ukraine itself has significant capabilities to attack Russia in its own territory that will go well beyond the range of ATACMS or the British-made Storm Shadow missiles. Austin concluded by telling Al Jazeera that America will give everything we can, but not necessarily everything that Zelensky wants. There are a couple of ways we can read into Austin's comments. The first is how they appear on the surface. America's defense secretary seems to be telling Ukraine that it's achieved plenty of success using drones to strike deep into Russian territory. That's true. June 2024 alone saw Ukraine strike 4 Russian oil refineries with drones, with regular attacks in the Black Sea also allowing Ukraine to stop the offensive threat Russia presents from Crimea. To Austin and many of Ukraine's allies, the ability to carry out these drone-based attacks means Ukraine can already strike Russia at range. Add to that the early August invasion of Kursk, and Ukraine appears to be making a good argument for why it doesn't need long-range missiles at all. Zelensky disagrees. However, the second interpretation of Austin's comments could be that he knows something that the rest of the world doesn't. The US doesn't need to supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles or allow them to use those missiles in Russia because Ukraine is on its way to building perfectly capable missiles of its own. And that brings us to the new Ukrainian homemade weapons. On August 26, 2024, the DW News YouTube channel published a report on Ukraine's efforts to produce its own long-range missiles. While President Zelensky lobbies for these restrictions to be lifted, Ukraine is also building its own guided missiles in the hope of one day becoming self-sufficient, the report claimed. In truth, that self-sufficiency may have come much earlier in the war, were it not for precise Russian strikes conducted in April 2022. In that month, Russia used its missiles to take out a factory that was capable of producing the same guided missiles that Ukraine is now on the verge of being able to produce once again, forcing Zelensky to make repeated pleas to his Western allies to allow him to use the missiles they provide in Russia. The strike put a severe dent in Ukraine's missile production capacities. However, DW News notes that the plant has been rebuilt and likely fortified with anti-air defenses, meaning Ukraine is now preparing to produce 2 missiles that could be real game changers in the war: the Vilka missile system and the Neptune guided cruise missile. Hints of these production capabilities first arrived in July 2024. In a short report, the TASS Russian news agency quoted Zelensky as saying, "Apart from drones, yes, we are dealing with other systems that will give us the opportunity to have a longer range. There has been some research and development." ABC built on the DW News report in late August, revealing that restarting production on the Vilka and Neptune systems wasn't all that Ukraine was up to. The research and development Zelensky mentioned in July 2024 has resulted in the creation of a missile drone dubbed the Palyanytsia, which is named after a traditional type of Ukrainian bread. That name also has a special meaning to Ukraine due to it being so difficult to pronounce that it was able to use it to weed out Russian spies during the early stages of the war. Now the name will take on a whole new meaning as it will symbolize what Zelensky calls a new class of weapon. The point here is simple. Sooner or later, Ukraine won't have to rely on its allies to provide missiles and also beg them for permission to use those missiles in Russian territory. It's building its own, a series of missiles upon which no restrictions can be placed. That brings us to another question. Just what type of damage is this trio of missiles capable of inflicting? We'll start with the Vilka. A Ukrainian-designed heavy multiple rocket launcher, the Vilka fires guided missiles and is based on the BM-30 Smerch design. It's also got a new launcher. The system entered the Ukrainian armed forces back in 2018. The weapon weighs 33 tons and is crewed by 4 people, with it firing 300mm caliber missiles from its 12 barrels. It's also road mobile. The Vilka is equipped with a YAMZ 7511.10 turbocharged engine that can get to wherever it needs to go in order to fire on Russian positions. The problem for Ukraine hasn't been that it didn't have these launchers available. Rather, Russia's April 2022 attack on its manufacturing plant rendered the Vilka useless because Ukraine didn't have the missiles the weapon could fire. Those missiles are dubbed Vilka Ms and they can travel for up to 80 miles. As such, they're not the rangiest of missiles in the new Ukrainian homemade arsenal, though they can certainly fly far enough to cause problems behind the war's front lines. Those missiles are also cleverly designed. They use a GPS-free guidance system, which makes them immune to the type of satellite navigation jamming that can send GPS-guided missiles off course. They're also versatile. A Vilka-M rocket can accept several types of warheads, with the rocket's inertial correction system ensuring the stabilization needed to keep the rocket on course. Ukraine demonstrated how it could put these missiles to good use in January 2024. That's when Ukraine conducted a firing test for its missile system, which showed that a Vilka rocket is capable of traveling significantly further than rockets fired via the M142 HIMARS systems the US has provided. Ukrainian ground forces are also reported to have used the Vilka system during their January 2024 attack on Belgorod, which you may recognize as one of the latest regions Ukraine has invaded since it experienced such success in Kursk. With its production facilities back up and running, Ukraine now has the ability to create rockets it needs for its Vilka system. That means we're likely to see a lot more of this launcher as we approach the end of 2024 and move into 25. Most worryingly for Putin, the Vilka is arguably the weakest of the three homemade weapons Ukraine is set to bring to the war. Far more damaging to Russia will be the R-360 Neptune guided cruise missile. Like the Vilka system, the Neptune isn't a brand new weapon. It was first introduced during the 2015 Arms and Security exhibition in Kyiv, with its first flight believed to have taken place sometime in mid-2016. With 2017 came further tests as the Neptune was put through its paces alongside the Vilka missile system, though the results of those tests weren't made public. That typically indicates that the tests showed tweaks were needed to get the missile up and running. Another test came in August 2018, this time supported by reports that the missile successfully hit a target at a range of 62 miles. More successful tests came in 2019, which is the same year that the missile was officially signed off. It would start getting delivered to the Ukrainian military in the same year. The missile has made numerous headlines since the beginning of Putin's special military operation. Early in the war, Ukraine used it to hit the Russian cruiser Moskva, with the attack ultimately leading to the sinking of one of the largest ships since World War II. More ships in the Black Sea have also been victims of Neptune missile attacks, including the Konstantin Olshansky and the Kamuna. As for the missile itself, it weighs 1,920 pounds and has an operational range of between 120 and 190 miles. It's capable of reaching subsonic speeds while delivering a warhead weighing 330 pounds. But by now you may have a question. If Ukraine has been using the Neptune since the beginning of the war, why is it being feared as a new homemade weapon? One word: modifications. In April 2024, Army Recognition reported on Ukrainian plans to extend the range of its Neptune cruise missile so that it could fly for up to 610 miles, all while it revealed that it planned to boost production tenfold. That enhanced range would allow the Neptune to strike deeper into the Black Sea region, perhaps even allowing it to reach ships docked in Crimea, and would make it invaluable for striking Russian territory if Ukraine were ever able to create a version of it that could strike land targets. That's precisely what Ukraine has done. On August 20, 2024, Army Recognition reported that Ukraine had successfully developed a version of the R-360 Neptune that's capable of traveling up to 248 miles and has been tweaked so that it can strike land targets as readily as it can hit ships at sea. The new version of the missile has even seen action already. It was reportedly used in a late-night attack on the Chelino military airfield near Kursk, just a week before Ukraine launched its invasion into the oblast. So Ukraine is now capable of producing two types of missiles. When combined, they're capable of striking targets on both land and at sea. With the Neptune, they also have a missile that offers a good amount of range, with that range potentially being extended to over 600 miles if Zelensky's plans are anything to go by. Finally, there's the new homemade weapon. The weapon could prove superior to the ATACMS long-range missiles Ukraine so desperately wants to be able to use in Russia, the Palianitsia. Not much is known about the Palianitsia at the time of writing. When reporting on the new homemade missile, ABC News speculated that the missile would have a range of up to 430 miles, which would put it on par with the ATACMS, allowing it to solve the problems that come with Ukraine not having permission to use American-made missiles inside Russia. Ukraine's Defense Minister Rustem Umerov also posted about the Palianitsia on his Facebook page, noting that Ukraine is preparing its response when talking about Russia's missile attacks in late August. Weapons of its own production are coming, claims Umerov, who shared the post alongside a map showing several Russian airfields, including the Savozlaika Air Base. This led ABC News to speculate that the upcoming missile would be capable of hitting over 20 Russian airfields from Ukraine, which would put a severe dent in Russia's aerial capabilities. Speaking about the missile with the Associated Press, Mikhailo Fedorov, who serves Ukraine as its technology minister, said, "I think this will be a game changer because we will be able to strike where Russia doesn't expect it today." In other words, the Palianitsia could be seen as an expansion of the tactics Ukraine has adopted since the Kursk invasion. Defending territory is not the only thing Ukraine can do. It's going to attack Russia on its own soil, forcing Putin to completely rethink how he approaches the war that he started. The Kyiv Independent provides more details about Ukraine's revolutionary new missile drone. It quoted a defense expert named Andriy Karuk, who claims that the weapon is essentially a new type of cruise missile, because a cruise missile is an unmanned aerial vehicle with a rocket, or in this case, turbojet engine. Karuk notes that the Palianitsia is a fairly small missile too, likely meaning it will carry an explosive charge in the few tens of kilograms range rather than the several hundred seen in a standard cruise missile. Other analysts dispute Karuk's claims that the Palianitsia is essentially a cruise missile. One of them is Federico Borsari, who works at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He says the Palianitsia isn't a cruise missile because missiles fly at higher speed compared to what we know about the Palianitsia. Instead, he says it's more like a one-way drone that shares some of the characteristics typically seen in a cruise missile. Finally, Alexander Dmitriev, who is an advisor on unmanned automated systems to Ukraine's ground forces commander, highlights the key difference between the Palianitsia and a standard cruise missile. The target of a cruise missile cannot be corrected during the flight, but a drone's can, he says. That's basically the difference. In short, the Palianitsia will be able to pack a larger punch than any of Ukraine's current drones, and it will do so while taking advantage of the same electronic control technology that makes drones so flexible. So the Palianitsia is not innovative in the sense that it's introducing brand new technologies to the Ukrainian battlefield. Rather, its innovations lie in remarkable new uses of technology that already exist. The electronic control technology is adapted from traditional drones, while the lifting wings and jet-powered engines come from existing cruise missiles. Put them all together, and you get a missile that brings range, explosive power, and the ability to change its target based on an operator's commands. That's terrifying for Putin. With the Palianitsia, Ukraine completes a trio of homemade weapons that look set to devastate Russia. But that brings us to another question. When are we likely to see these missiles become common fixtures in the Ukraine war? Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Alexander Kamyshin, provided some insight during an interview with DW News. When asked how long he thinks it will be before Ukraine becomes self-sufficient, he revealed that it's not production capabilities that are stopping it from doing so, it's money. At this point, we're ramping up local production, but for almost a year, we've been facing a scarce deficit of local government funding because the capabilities to produce are almost 3 times higher than the funding available. In other words, Ukraine has been capable of producing its own weapons, from a manufacturing standpoint, throughout Putin's special military operation. The one thing holding it back is that it hasn't been able to attract the investment needed to produce those weapons. That is now changing. According to Kamyshin, Ukraine and Denmark have come up with a novel mechanism that will allow Ukraine to build the Palianitsia, along with its other missiles, without having to worry about restrictions. Denmark is going to procure from Ukrainian manufacturers and donate to the Ukrainian army, claims the Minister of Strategic Industries. With this help, we can scale up faster because, as I told you, our capabilities are higher than the funding available. Ironically, the agreement to create this mechanism was made at the very UDCG conference during which Zelensky made his most recent plea for Western countries to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons inside Russia. On June 14th, Ukraine's government portal website offered further details, including a quote from Troelsland Poulsen, who serves as Denmark's defense minister. In addition to committing to support Ukraine's efforts to defend itself for the next decade, Poulsen said, "We are taking the lead in responding to a direct request from Ukraine to ensure that investments are made in Ukraine's defense industry in the near future." Ukraine's Rustem Umerov was also quick to laud the project, noting Ukraine's gratitude to Denmark for taking what he calls a great step in supporting the Ukrainian arms industry through direct investment. Denmark's investment is part of the Zaboyari Manufacturing Freedom Project, which aims to raise $10 billion for Ukrainian arms development by the end of 2024. The Danes' contribution is small compared to the goal, just $28.5 million, but the project as a whole offers Ukraine's allies a brand new way of supporting it. That will worry Putin. He has relied on Ukraine not being able to use missiles in Russia because those missiles come from countries that are wary of crossing a red line and provoking the Russian leader further. Now Ukraine has developed a mechanism through which countries can support its efforts to use missiles in Russia indirectly without having to provide weapons of their own. And that program is going to help Ukraine to develop the Palianitsia, along with its other homemade missiles, so that it can take the fight to Russia. Speaking about the Palianitsia to DW News, Alexander Kamyshin hailed it as a first-in-class Ukrainian product that's fully locally designed and manufactured. He also delivered a stark warning to Putin. That's the first one to go. Others will follow, and you will see how much we can make. In other words, Ukraine has more ideas in the pipeline. It just needs financial support from its allies to turn those ideas into reality. So what does all of this mean for Putin and his special military operation? For one, it means he can no longer rely on Ukraine only being able to fight against his forces on their own soil. That strategy was already thrown out of the window with the Kursk invasion, which has given Putin a massive problem he needs to solve as Ukraine continues to take and hold Russian territory. Following that up with an invasion of Belgorod means that Putin's headache turns into a full-blown migraine. He has to commit substantial amounts of soldiers and equipment to those areas to try and drive Ukraine out. Now throw Ukraine's Palianitsia into the mix, along with the other missiles it's producing, and Putin has even more issues to counter. The war is no longer about him throwing man after man at Ukraine's fortified positions in an attempt to slowly steal territory out from under Zelensky's nose. Putin's own country, the country he claims to be able to protect as he projects his strongman image, is under direct threat. People are being evacuated, territory is being taken, and now with funding from Denmark and the likelihood of future funding from its other allies, Ukraine has developed a homegrown way to finally be able to use missiles deep inside Russian territory. That puts Putin's military installations close to the front lines at risk. Remember that the Palianitsia is capable of hitting around 20 airfields in Russian territory already, and it could ultimately be the factor that forces Putin to the negotiating table. That has been Zelensky's goal all along. He has constantly called for tangible coercion of Russia to force it into negotiating a peace that will see Putin restore the land Russia has stolen from Ukraine, which includes Crimea. That coercion can't come from international pressure alone, Ukraine's leader believes, and now he has a weapon, several in fact, that nobody can stop him from using inside Russia. The Palianitsia promises to completely change the face of the Ukraine war, to the point where it may be capable of ending Putin's special military operation. But what do you think about this unique combination of drone and missile? Will Ukraine be able to produce it in high enough numbers to truly threaten Russia? Are other countries going to follow Denmark's lead by donating to the Zoboyari Manufacturing Freedom Project? Just how much equipment does the Ukrainian military have? It's a key question to ask considering that Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation is now in its third year, and it's clear his tactic is to throw soldiers at Ukraine until it can't withstand the constant pressure anymore. One of the keys to Ukraine's victory lies in sustaining its military to handle that constant bombardment, which means it needs equipment, a lot of it. So we come to this video review. We're going to divide the review into two parts, the first of which looks at key equipment Ukraine has received from Western allies. After that, we'll take a more general look at what Ukraine has in terms of general numbers, counting tanks, armored vehicles, and everything else its military can bring to bear against Russia. For Western equipment, we turn to the BBC for a list. While by no means exhaustive, it highlights the key weapon systems the West has provided to Ukraine, starting with the next-generation light anti-tank weapons or NLAWs. These are essentially shoulder-mounted rocket launchers that can fire a projectile up to 2,625 feet and are designed specifically to strike moving targets such as tanks and armored vehicles. They're also surprisingly easy to use. A soldier only needs about a day of training to get to grips with the technology. Each one weighs 27 pounds, making it light enough to carry onto the battlefield. Most of Ukraine's NLAW weapons arrived during the beginning of the war, with the national news reporting that around 12,100 of them have been donated to Ukraine as of March 2022. Britain was a major supplier of these weapons. It had sent more than 5,000 NLAWs to Ukraine by May 2022. So it's likely that Ukraine actually received more of these weapons following the 12,100 committed to it early in the war. However, it also lost some. Russian forces, along with members of the pro-Russian Donetsk People's Republic, captured several of the weapons in February 2022. Still, we can safely say Ukraine has over 10,000 NLAWs, which it has used to great effect to tackle Russia's tank-based threat. Next up, air defense systems. The two key air defense systems Ukraine has received from its Western partners are the short-range, British-made Starstreak missile system and the American-made Patriot system. Starting with Starstreak, this tripod-mounted system is portable and can be mounted both on land and in compatible vehicles. The missile this system fires is actually made up of a trio of tungsten darts, which are accelerated to speeds of around Mach 3, meaning they move at 3 times the speed of sound, and use a laser guiding system to improve accuracy for a fire-and-forget experience. This makes them a suitable counter to Russian helicopters, as well as making them capable of taking out many fixed-wing aircraft, including many of the Soviet-era fighters Russia is using in the Ukraine war. As for numbers, the Jamestown Foundation says that Ukraine has received 1,800 Starstreak missiles from its Western allies as of June 2024. The same organization also provides a comprehensive list of other missiles Ukraine has received and may have in stock. That includes 45 5V-55U missiles for its S-300 missile systems, which are the same type of anti-air systems Russia has been using to defend itself. Ukraine has also received 1,000 Pioran man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, from the West, alongside 800 Stinger MANPADS and 100 Igla MANPADS. Then we come to the Patriot system. As of June 2024, Ukraine was known to have 2 of these systems in place, though Voice of America reported in the same month that it was set to receive a further 3 Patriot batteries from the US, Romania, and Germany to bring its total to 5. Zelensky says Ukraine needs more. He feels that having a total of 25 Patriot systems would help Ukraine more effectively fight against Russia. A base unit is capable of firing either 4 PAC-2 missiles or a staggering 16 PAC-3 missiles, with each of those missiles having a track-via missile system built into it to help it reach its target. Each one can travel up to around 43 miles and can pack a warhead weighing 198 pounds. As for missile numbers, the Jamestown Foundation offers some insight. Ukraine has 365 PAC-2 anti-ballistic missiles that have been transferred to the country by Germany, the Netherlands, and the US. Next up is the M777 howitzer. Several countries have provided these GPS-guided artillery systems, including the US, Australia, and Canada. Each has a range of 25 miles, which matches the Soviet-era 2A36 Gyatstint B howitzer Russia is using, with the key advantage being that the M777 is far more accurate. Ukraine had 190 of these howitzers in May 2024, according to Forbes, with each being capable of firing 155mm shells weighing up to 100 pounds. However, other figures contradict this number. For instance, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, claims that Ukraine has received around 352 howitzers from its allies. The Forbes figure seems to more closely align with the number of howitzers provided by the US and Canada, which have combined to deliver 152 according to CSIS. So perhaps Forbes was focusing solely on North American donors. There's also the HIMARS artillery to consider, which can fire shells up to 50 miles, though the range is much higher if it's equipped with US-supplied ATACMS missiles. Ukraine had 39 of these HIMARS launchers, which have proven troublesome for Russia. It had failed to destroy a single one as of January 2024. Let's touch on ATACMS themselves, which are long-range missiles Ukraine could conceivably use to conduct strikes into Russian territory. They aren't the only long-range missiles Ukraine has. The country has also received British-made Storm Shadow missiles and French-made Scalps, which are essentially the same missile. It's unclear how many ATACMS Ukraine had, though Forbes reported it had received a shipment of around 20 at some point during 2023. It's a similar story with Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. Numbers are hard to come by, though we do know that French President Emmanuel Macron pledged 40 Scalp missiles to Ukraine in January 2024. That was on top of an unknown number of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles already sent to Ukraine, so their numbers may exceed 100 at this point. Next, we move on to tanks. Ukraine has received 3 main types of tanks from its Western allies: the American M1 Abrams, Challenger 2 tanks from the UK, and German-made Leopard 2 tanks from its European and American allies. Starting with the M1 Abrams, the tank is crewed by 4 people, one more than a typical Ukrainian main battle tank needs, and weighs 67 tons. Its Cobham armor protects it against direct hits, and the tank comes equipped with a gas turbine engine that requires more fuel than a similar tank, but gives it more power on the battlefield. Ukraine doesn't have a ton of these tanks. The US agreed to send 31 back in January 2023 and doesn't appear to have sent any more since. Like the M1 Abrams, the Challenger 2 is a 4-crew tank, though it's even heavier than its American equivalent. It weighs 75 tons and is also equipped with Cobham armor. Interestingly, despite being British-made, the tank uses non-NATO standard ammunition. Like the US, the UK agreed to send a batch of these tanks to Ukraine in January 2023, though these numbers were a little lower, at 14 compared to the 31 Abrams. Finally, there's the Leopard 2, which is another 4-person tank which matches the M1 Abrams in that it weighs 67 tons. Unlike the Abrams, it uses a special composite armor to deflect fire, and it has an advantage over the Challenger 2. The tank fires NATO standard 120mm rounds. That means practically any NATO-aligned country can provide ammunition for the tank, even if it isn't able to provide the tanks themselves. It's believed that Ukraine has a little over 130 of these tanks, with Germany, Poland, Sweden, Canada and Denmark being among the providers. Ukraine has also received a large number of Leopard 1 tanks, likely over 270, with 88 coming from Germany and a further 80 being pledged by Denmark in March 2023. These tanks haven't had as much of an impact on the Ukraine war as was anticipated. Russia has the advantage in terms of sheer numbers, and the tanks have proven less impactful in counter-offensives than other measures, such as drones. Speaking of drones, Ukraine has received several types from its Western allies, starting with the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2. Made famous by a viral war song composed by Ukrainian soldiers in the drone's honor, the Bayraktar TB2 is capable of firing missiles and has proven to be an effective force against tanks and armored vehicles throughout the war. Ukraine doesn't have many of these drones. Breaking Defense says it had around 20 TB2s at the start of the war and has since been reported to have received around 50. However, there's a caveat to that number. It's possible that some of the frameworks received were inoperable. Far more present on the battlefield is the Switchblade, which is a US-made kamikaze drone of which Ukraine is believed to have around 700 units. Dubbed the loitering munition system by its manufacturer AeroVironment, the drone's specs vary depending on the variant received. The Switchblade 300 can stay in the air for up to 20 minutes and has a range of about 18.6 miles. As for the Switchblade 600, it bumps the range up between 24.9 and 56 miles, with the ability to stay in flight for around 40 minutes. Both can pack powerful munitions, though the Switchblade 600 is the far more devastating of the two. It can carry up to 33 pounds of munitions. That makes the Switchblade 600 especially effective for anti-armor purposes, such as kamikaze attacks, as well as dealing with Russian personnel. Then there's the DJI Mavic drone. Unlike the other two drones, the DJI Mavic is a commercial surveillance drone that isn't capable of attacking the enemy. What it can do is reach a maximum speed of 42.5 miles per hour, which, when combined with its tiny 11.1-inch wingspan, makes it extremely difficult to target when it's moving. The drone can travel up to 18.6 miles and can reach a maximum altitude of 19,685 feet, making it incredibly difficult to spot by eye alone. Interestingly, the drone is made by a Chinese manufacturer, which has sold around 8,200 of them to Ukraine as of May 2024. The final item on the list of donated weapons to Ukraine is a big one: fighter jets, specifically F-16 fighter jets. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has spent much of the war pleading for these powerful American-made fighters, claiming that Ukraine will need 128 of them to properly fight against Russia's aerial superiority. Ukraine doesn't have that many. In fact, the first 18 months of the war were marked by Zelensky's repeated pleas for the jets and America's refusal to supply them. The US finally relented, though it isn't providing the F-16s itself. Instead, it's permitted other NATO allies to give F-16s to Ukraine, with the CSIS stating that several NATO countries have since joined forces to commit 65 F-16s to Ukraine. Again, that's less than half the amount Zelensky claims his forces need, but it's a start. Extensive training of Ukrainian pilots was also required before those F-16s could be utilized, with the first jets taking to the skies in early August 2024. With that, we wrap up our examination of the main weapon systems Ukraine's Western allies have provided since the outbreak of the war. From here, we take a more general approach, examining the country's stockpiles by weapon type rather than specific weapon systems. And that begins with a piece of equipment that Russia has consistently used to try to establish dominance on the ground: tanks. Like Russia, the majority of Ukraine's tank stock was made up of Soviet-era vehicles, with a handful of more modern tanks thrown in for good measure. For instance, Ukraine has around 28 T-55s at the start of the war, along with 42 T-62s. However, its main tanks were the T-64 and T-72. It has almost 1,300 of the former, including its variants, and 867 of the latter, with 117 of its T-72s being the Avenger model. As for the more modern tanks, it has a paltry 5 T-84s, which is one of the few tanks Ukraine builds itself, as well as a stockpile of 14 T-90 tanks that it bought from Russia prior to the war's outbreak. Add around 60 PT-61 Twardey tanks from Poland into the mix, along with the Western-supplied tanks we covered earlier, and Ukraine has a fairly impressive tank force when it comes to sheer numbers, around 2,700 in total. However, it should be noted that most of these tanks are the older Soviet-era models that are ineffective against modern weapon systems. Of course, that may not present much of a problem for Ukraine, as Russia has also been forced to rely on these older tanks as the war has progressed, with thousands of them falling victim to Ukrainian rocket-propelled grenades and drones. From tanks, we move into armored and utility vehicles. Starting with armored personnel carriers or APCs and infantry fighting vehicles or IFVs, this was an area where Ukraine fell vastly short of Russia during the early days of the war. Before the war, the country had around 2,000 Soviet-era APCs and IFVs, which was enough for the Ukrainian army of the time. The problem is that the size of Ukraine's army has doubled since the beginning of the war, reaching around 900,000 active soldiers. Add to this APC and IFV losses, which Forbes estimates at around 1,000 as of April 2024, and Ukraine's stockpiles were dwindling at a time when it needed more vehicles. It wasn't helped by some of its allies being extremely slow to provide APCs and IFVs. Canada, for instance, announced that it would donate 89 Bison armored vehicles, which have a combat load of around 27,400 pounds and can carry 2 people. Those vehicles can be equipped with a range of weapons, including M72 rocket launchers, a 7.62mm C6 medium machine gun, and a 76mm grenade dispenser with multiple barrels. The first 39 of these Bisons, all of which were used in current Canadian military stock, arrived quickly. As for the other 50, which were enough to transport an entire battalion, those will be built new and took around a year to arrive. The situation improved as more of Ukraine's allies started donating vehicles. Now, Forbes believes Ukraine has received around 7,500 APCs and IFVs since the beginning of the war, as well as restoring around 10,000 Soviet-era vehicles that had previously been mothballed. That would give a total of 19,500 with the initial 2,000 the Ukrainian military had available. However, there's a caveat. Ukraine had likely lost around 5,000 of its APCs and IFVs as of May 2024, putting it down to around 14,500. Still, it's at least getting quality, even if it isn't matching the sheer quantity of Russia's APVs on the battlefield. Statista reports that almost 2,000 of the vehicles Ukraine has received are American-made armored Humvees, along with several hundred Bradley IFVs, armored AUVs, M113 APCs, and a host of other vehicles. Ukraine will likely need at least 1,000 more, however, as it moves towards mobilizing greater troop numbers. There's a clear pattern emerging here. Ukraine has a lot of equipment, which is being supplemented by its allies, but it still falls short of Russia in terms of sheer numbers. The key for Ukraine comes in quality. The weapons it's been receiving from the West are generally better than much of the Soviet-era equipment Ukraine would be forced to field if left to its own devices. Plus, Western equipment is generally better than the equipment Russia is fielding overall. Next up, we come to artillery systems. CSIS says that Ukraine started the war with 1,150 Soviet-era howitzers, with 350 of those being 122mm howitzers, while 750 were 750mm. Adding around 424 donated howitzers from Western allies, which includes the 352 mentioned earlier, plus around 70 older or smaller ones, and you get a total of around 1,600 artillery pieces. While this may seem like a lot, it's worth considering that the majority of these artillery units are still Soviet-era. That creates ammunition problems as the shells aren't readily available, forcing Ukraine to increasingly rely on its Western artillery units to combat Russia. Speaking of shells, the US has been helping Ukraine in that regard. CSIS says that America scoured the globe to find Soviet-era shells it could acquire on Ukraine's behalf, resulting in it sending 45,000 152mm shells and around 20,000 122mm rounds. That may be the limit. Russia and China are the main producers of these types of shells, and neither is going to be supplying them to Ukraine anytime soon. CSIS also says that the amount of artillery Ukraine needs doesn't align with the amount it has. It says that the combined border Ukraine needs to defend is around 1,550 miles, roughly working out to 1 artillery unit per mile. For comparison, West Germany deployed 2,400 heavy artillery pieces to defend the 1,367-mile borders with East Germany and Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. Not quite 2 units per mile, but far closer than what Ukraine has achieved. Artillery shell supplies are also a huge challenge for Ukraine. Though we don't have exact numbers beyond those for the Soviet-era shells the US has managed to acquire, Ukrainian officials stated back in May 2023 that it required around 20,000 artillery shells per day to use its Western-supplied units to their full capacity. Lawfare says it was receiving nowhere close to that. It had enough shells to fire around 9,000 per day at the time, with those numbers having dropped to around 2,000 per day since. So Ukraine is doing a lot with relatively little, the story of its achievements during the war. Next, we move on to the country's aerial capacity, and it's here where we start to see a major shortfall. The 65 F-16s mentioned earlier couldn't come soon enough on the fighter jet side of things, as Ukraine fell far behind Russia in this regard during the early days of the war. According to the UK publication The Evening Standard, Ukraine had 105 MiG-29s, Su-24s and Su-25s in February 2022, along with around 50 Su-27s. Anybody who knows their fighter jets will be able to tell you that all of these fixed-wing craft are Soviet-era, with their numbers also being far lower than the literal thousands of these jets, plus more modern variants, Russia was able to field. For context, the most modern of these fighters is the Russian-made Su-27 MiG-29, which both entered production in 1982. Both were designed to counter the American F-15 and 16, though neither ended up beating them. As for the Su-24, it entered service in 1974, with production of the jet ending in 1993. It's a similar story with the Su-25. That jet entered service in 1978, with production ceasing in 2017. The end of production, combined with both of these jets also being Russian-made, presented problems for Ukraine, as it's difficult to source replacement components for maintenance. Hence why Zelensky says Ukraine needs even more F-16s. The situation was even worse on the helicopter front. Numbers are difficult to come by here, though it seems likely that Ukraine has a little over 100 helicopters in total. The Mi-24 makes up the largest portion of its stockpile, with 45 of these attack choppers being in Ukraine's Air Force. Capable of flying 8 passengers, the chopper is a Soviet-era gunship that entered service in 1972 and is currently used by 58 countries. Ukraine also has 22 Mi-17 choppers, which were introduced in 1975 and are typically used as transport helicopters, though there are variants capable of acting as gunships. Collectively, those two helicopter designs, which are around 50 years old, make up over half of Ukraine's available helicopter stock. Russia should have destroyed Ukraine in the aerial battle. However, that's not what we've seen in the war so far. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost 367 planes and 328 helicopters fighting against Ukraine. For context, that's around 3 times the number of planes and helicopters Ukraine has available in its entire air force, with the losses being so bad that Russia has essentially abandoned all attempts to exert its aerial dominance. So Ukraine may not have many fighter jets and helicopters, but it also hasn't needed them for defensive purposes so far. The arrival of 65 F-16s into Ukraine will thus give it more opportunities to launch attacks on Russian positions. Perhaps it may even find a use for its Soviet-era aircraft during those assaults. Still, this brings us to the next category we're going to examine: anti-air defenses. Russia's lack of success on the aerial front comes down, in part, to Ukraine having exceptional anti-air capabilities. Ukraine recognized the importance of maintaining a strong anti-air arsenal in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. According to the Jamestown Foundation, May 2014, which came 3 months after the annexation, saw 2 Ukrainian organizations, the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies and the Defense Express, combined to conduct a study into Ukraine's anti-air capabilities. That study was titled On the Decline, Partial Loss of Ukraine's Defense Potential 2004 to 2014, and it found some positives and far more negatives. On the positive side, the study found that Ukraine had around 5,000 guided anti-aircraft missiles in its stockpiles. These included about 1,000 5V-28 missiles for its S-200V anti-air systems, along with 3,000 5V-55s for its S-300P and 800 9M83 missiles for its S-300V. Throw in a further 1,300 9M38 and 9M38M1 surface-to-air or SAM missiles, and you have a pretty large stockpile. But there was a problem. The same study found that most of Ukraine's missile systems had reached the end of their service lives without being properly extended, meaning the majority of these missiles were useless. The S-200s and S-300Vs were even in the process of being decommissioned, leaving Ukraine with thousands of missiles it couldn't properly use when the war broke out. All told, it seems that Ukraine had around 250 S-300P anti-air systems that were actually usable, several of which it's since lost due to Russian attacks. Forbes says that Ukraine was losing S-300s at a rate of several per week back in April 2022, though it's likely the loss rate has slowed down since. It's receiving more in drips and drabs. For instance, January 2024 saw Greece approve the transfer of a small number of S-300 systems to Ukraine, despite opposition from Russia. Still, the situation didn't look good. That's why the Patriot and Starstreak systems mentioned earlier have proven so important to Ukraine, as have the huge number of missiles the country's Western allies have provided. According to the Jamestown Foundation, Ukraine had received 4,885 anti-air missiles of various types by June 2024, which is almost the same amount of missiles it had stockpiled before the war. Only these missiles are usable in the anti-air systems Ukraine has available. Next up, we come to drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. We've covered the large number of drones Ukraine has received from its Western allies, along with the thousands of commercial drones it's been able to procure from Chinese manufacturers. However, those drones only scratch the surface, as Ukraine has switched its focus to manufacturing UAVs domestically. In March 2024, Reuters reported that Ukraine already had 10 companies working on manufacturing drones that would be capable of reaching Russian cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. Some of those drones would have ranges of around 620 miles, a range category that simply didn't exist before the Ukraine war began. If nothing else, this showcases how crucial drones have become to Ukraine during the war, and about a month later, solid numbers started emerging. March 2024 saw the Kyiv Independent report that Ukraine has developed the capacity to manufacture a staggering 150,000 drones every single month. Assuming it maintained that capacity throughout 2024, it would have around 2 million drones by the end of the year. Perhaps more, in fact, as the country's Strategic Industries Deputy Minister, Hanna Vozdiar, was quoted at the time as claiming that Ukraine is already well past the million mark in terms of production. Beyond the 10 companies focusing on long-range drones, a further 200 had become involved in drone development, with 60 of those already having received large orders from Ukraine's government. It gets even better on the UAV front for Ukraine. The same report noted that NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg revealed plans for a massive uptick in the amount of drones being supplied to Ukraine by its Western allies. He estimated that donated numbers would reach 1 million by the end of 2024. Add to that the 1 million Ukraine already had, and the extra million it looks set to produce by the end of 2024, and you get 3 million, about 3 drones for every active member of Ukraine's military. These drones can serve a host of purposes, from simple reconnaissance to launching full-scale attacks on Russian equipment. It's also unclear whether this production includes unmanned underwater vehicles and similar sea drones, which have proven especially effective in helping Ukraine tackle Russia's Black Sea fleet. Which brings us to the final category we'll examine: naval assets. There aren't many, as Ukraine's only coast extends into the Black Sea, which Russia ostensibly controls. Global Firepower, or GFP, which releases annual rankings of the military strength of 145 countries, says that Ukraine's navy has 104 assets. About a third of its navy is made up of small patrol vessels, with 33 in the fleet, and Ukraine has no submarines, aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, or corvettes. Those patrol ships include the P-153 Priluki, which is a former Matka-class missile boat, alongside some small gunboats like the Zhuk 1400M class and the PO-2. But beyond that, Ukraine barely has an attacking navy to speak of. The other 71 naval assets include 4 landing craft, 3 mine warfare vessels such as a pair of Sandown-class ships, and an assortment of special-purpose vessels including supply, survey, and tugboats. And with that, we complete our in-depth examination of the quantity of military equipment Ukraine has available, as well as the quality of some of the best pieces. We have, of course, missed out some of the basics, such as small firearms and helmets. We can safely assume Ukraine has over 1 million small arms and rifles, simply by virtue of its military containing 900,000 active members, with similar numbers likely for helmets, body armor, and similar supporting gear. But what do you think about these numbers? Are they enough to help Ukraine win the war, considering how much more Russia's military has? Or does Ukraine's intelligent use of this equipment give it the edge over the invading Russian forces?